Chapter 58. Son-in-law, take a look. Did you miss anything? Fong walked in from the outside carrying a large bag, took out the things inside and placed them in front of Li Yi. Bezoar, peppermint, honeysuckle, spices, a few jars of wine that old Fong had bought from the prefecture city. Looking at the pile of items in front of him, Li Yi counted them and nodded. Old Fong was very reliable. He did not miss out on any of the items that he had been instructed to buy. As the autumn deepened, the mosquitoes became even more rampant when night fell. For this body with a special physique, every night was the most torturous time for Li Yi. Now that the candied Ha's business was on the right track, Fong and a few others could handle it. There was no need for Li Yi to worry more. He finally had time to solve the biggest problem that troubled him. Son-in-law, it's not New Year's Day. Why did you buy so much wine? Fong's gaze was fixed on the wine jar on the ground. He involuntarily swallowed a mouthful of saliva and looked at Li Yi. In the past, when the family had no money, there were only a few times a year when they were willing to spend a few coins to buy a bowl of wine at the wine shop in the market at the foot of the mountain to satisfy their cravings. The taste was enough to be remembered for several days. Although he did not have to worry about food and clothing these days and had a lot of surplus, Fong, who was afraid of poverty, was still very thrifty in life. It was easy to earn copper money, but it was harder for him to spend it. Naturally, it was impossible for him to be extravagant enough to enjoy wine and meat all day long. Who said it's not New Year's Day? Li Yi raised his eyebrows, looked back at Fong and said, "Isn't it the Mid-Autumn Festival in a few days? These days I have been busy with the candied Ha's business. Everyone has worked hard. I will reward everyone." When Fong heard this, his eyes suddenly lit up. "Is this wine for the Mid-Autumn Festival?" "No," Li Yi said very simply. This wine was used to make floral water to repel mosquitoes. He could not let Fong spoil it. Fong's expression froze and he was speechless for a moment. Ignoring the bitterness in Fong's eyes, Li Yi opened his mouth again and said, "Go find some iron pots and some empty bamboo tubes. We're about to start working." Li Yi originally wanted to postpone the purification of the alcohol for a while and make the soap first. However, his plans could not keep up with the changes, so he had to put the purification of the alcohol first. There was no other reason. To make a mosquito-repellent floral water, it was necessary to use a high concentration of alcohol. Fong was very efficient. He found the iron pot very quickly. Under Li Yi's guidance, it took him half a day to build the alcohol distillation device. Distilling alcohol was not as simple as heating it in a pot. If the temperature was too high, the alcohol and water would evaporate together. After condensing, the alcohol would still be of a low concentration, and it would not be purified. This was a simple distillation device. It first heated the water and used the water temperature to evaporate the alcohol. The alcohol vapor condensed above and entered the bamboo tube. What flowed out was the purified alcohol. Li Yi could easily find the schematic diagram of the distillation device in the book, but the equipment such as flasks and glass tubes could not be realized at present. In desperation, he could only settle for the next best thing and replace it with these simple things in front of him. Although the effect would definitely be a lot worse, as long as he could get alcohol with a concentration of more than 75%, it would be enough. After all the preparations were done, Li Yi ignited the flame below. The next thing to do was to wait. Fong scratched his head. He looked at Li Yi for a while and then looked at the strange thing his son-in-law asked him to make. His brain was a mess. As drops of wine flowed out of the hollow bamboo tube, gradually the kitchen began to fill with a strong wine aroma. Gulp. Fong swallowed a mouthful of saliva. Li Yi turned his head and glanced at him. Fong immediately wiped the corner of his mouth and looked away from the bowl under the bamboo tube, pretending that nothing had happened. When the speed of the wine flowing out of the bamboo tube became extremely slow, Li Yi knew that the wine in the pot was almost distilled. He took out a chopstick and dipped it into the bowl. After tasting it, he frowned slightly. Although the alcohol content after distilling was much higher than before, it still did not meet his requirements. It seems that this distillation device is still too simple. If I want to produce it on a large scale in the future and increase the efficiency, I need to improve the distillation device. Li Yi murmured. He poured all the distilled wine into an empty jar and replaced it with fresh wine for the second distillation. Smelling the fragrance in the air, Fong's throat kept trembling. He wanted to pick up the jar next to him and drink to his heart's content. However, he thought that this wine would definitely be of great use to his son-in-law, so he restrained this thought. The alcohol content after distilling was far from enough. The device was simple and crude, and he had to make up for the number of times. Li Yi repeated the distillation over and over again. This way the alcohol content would increase a little every time. According to the book, using the distillation method to distill alcohol could only achieve a maximum alcohol concentration of about 95%. Of course, it was impossible for Li Yi to achieve such a high alcohol concentration with a few broken pots, but 80% was enough for him. After repeated distillation a few times, Li Yi found that the alcohol content did not increase much. Only then did he give up. Gulp. Fong, who was beside him, swallowed a mouthful of saliva again. Glancing at Fong, Li Yi really could not stand it anymore. He divided a small bowl of distilled alcohol and handed it to him. "Alright, don't be greedy. Have a taste of this wine." Hearing this, Fong's eyes lit up. After taking the bowl, he couldn't wait to drink it. Li Yi watched as Fong's face turned from black to red. He let out a comfortable moan. The expression on his face was extremely satisfied. He said loudly, "Good wine." Plop. After saying these two words, Fong's body swayed a few times and fell to the ground, unconscious. Looking at Fong, who was lying on the ground and snoring, Li Yi could not help but feel some contempt in his heart. This guy looked so strong, but it turned out that he was also an embroidered pillow. One gulp and he was not much stronger than himself. Putting the distilled alcohol to the tip of his nose and smelling it, a spicy smell rushed straight into his lungs. In just an instant, Li Yi felt a little dizzy. He quickly moved the wine bowl away. At this time he realized that the alcohol in front of him was more than 75% alcohol concentration. In the previous world, alcohol with a concentration higher than 60% seemed to be prohibited from being sold in the country. Looking down at Fong, who was lying on the ground, Li Yi could not help but twitch the corner of his mouth. "You're already an adult, but you still can't resist the temptation. You deserve it." Chapter 59. Fong was carried back to his home by Li Yi's men. When he was carried away, he kept muttering, "Good wine." Li Yi clearly noticed that the two men's eyes lit up when they smelled the wine on Fong. At that time, Li Yi mocked Fong a little in his heart, but it didn't take long for him to regret it. He really shouldn't have tricked Fong into drinking the wine. That was a high concentration of more than 75% alcohol. If he didn't sleep until tomorrow morning, it was estimated that Fong wouldn't wake up. If he didn't wake up, Li Yi would have to do the next work alone. Bezoar, peppermint, honeysuckle spices. Grind all of these things into powder, then put the distilled alcohol in a porcelain bottle and mixed it with the ground powder. Then shake the porcelain bottle continuously to ensure that they were mixed well. Both bezoar and honeysuckle had the effect of clearing heat and detoxifying. The function of mint was mainly used to repel mosquitoes. As for those spices, of course, it was to make the scent of the floral water smell better. This was a simple preparation method of floral water that Li Yi found in the book. In terms of effect, it was certainly not comparable to the big brands such as Zhou Xian or Longliqi in the future, but Li Yi's requirements were not high as long as the mosquito repellent effect was okay. According to the book, the concentration of 75% alcohol was mixed with powdered bezoar, honeysuckle, peppermint, and so on, and then kept shaking for half an hour. After they were fully mixed, the residue was filtered out, and the simple floral water was successfully prepared. Thus, when the servant girl came to the kitchen, she saw the son-in-law holding a porcelain bottle in his hand. He looked as if he was possessed, shaking it back and forth. "Son-in-law, what's wrong with you?" The little maid ran over in a hurry and looked at Li Yi with eyes full of worry. If the son-in-law was really possessed, what could he do? Even an Iron Man would not be able to withstand such a long period of shaking. Just as Li Yi was feeling a little dizzy and nauseous, Xiao Huan's figure appeared at the right time. "Xiao Huan, come here quickly and help me shake this bottle." With Xiao Huan's help, he could finally rest for a while. Li Yi looked at the little maid who stood there shaking the porcelain bottle stupidly and did not know what had happened. He thought to himself that when he prepared the floral dew on a large scale in the future, he had to think of a reliable way to ensure that they were fully integrated. It was not a long-term solution to hold the bottle and shake it every time. The two of them took turns, and after about half an hour, Li Yi estimated that it was about time. He pulled out the cork and passed the liquid inside the bottle through a piece of clean gauze to remove the undissolved residue. After the filtration, a translucent liquid was obtained. At the same time, a familiar fragrance began to fill the room. "Young master, what is this? It smells so good." The young maidservant widened her eyes and looked at Li Yi in surprise. "It seems that there are a little too many spices. Next time reduce the amount by 1/3. Li Yi murmured and put the first successfully prepared floral dew in a new porcelain bottle. The first preparation of floral dew was relatively successful. Although there were inevitably some flaws, as long as he did a few more experiments, he would always be able to find the most suitable formula. Li Yi could not wait to experiment with the efficacy of the floral dew he prepared. "Xiao Huan, hurry up and boil water. I want to take a bath later." "Yes, young master." The young maidservant looked at the strange thing in the kitchen with some doubts and looked at the back of Li Yi, who left with some joy. Her heart was full of curiosity. What did the son-in-law come up with this time? He poured some floral dew into the bathtub and took a comfortable hot bath. He immediately felt refreshed and his body exuded a faint fragrance. In order to verify the mosquito repellent effect, Li Yi stayed in the corner of the room with the most mosquitoes for a while. The mosquitoes that were willing to be intimate with him were really much less than before. Success. Seeing the mosquito repellent effect of floral dew, Li Yi's face showed joy. This showed that the method of using floral dew to repel mosquitoes was feasible. Next time he could add more mosquito-repellent herbs like peppermint to get floral dew with a stronger mosquito-repellent effect. Similarly, if he modified the formula and thought more about the spices, wouldn't the end result be perfume? This was simply killing two birds with one stone. However, for the promotion of floral dew and perfume in this world, Li Yi still did not have much confidence in his heart at this time. In the past he had read many time travel novels. The protagonists invented various modern items in the ancient world with knowledge that was hundreds and thousands of years ahead of the ancients. They were very popular with the ancients. They counted money until their hands cramped. They had beautiful wives and concubines, big houses, groups of servants, and lived a luxurious and extravagant life. However, Li Yi, who had real experience, deeply understood that reality was far more painful than ideals. Some things were very simple to think about, but when it was really realized, all kinds of difficulties would come one after another. What he needed to do now was to improve the alcohol purification device as much as possible. If the efficiency of each distillation was as low as the first time, it would never work. In addition, he also needed to build a separate processing workshop. After all, he couldn't always do it in his own kitchen. Moreover, after the scale of production was expanded, the small space in the kitchen was far from meeting the requirements. Fortunately, Li Yi still needed some time to improve the distillation equipment and improve the formula. The construction of the workshop was not so urgent. What's more, the location of the workshop, how to build it, and how to operate it after it was built had to be decided after careful consideration. Of course, Li Yi couldn't do these things alone. Therefore, he asked Fong and the others to get out of the candied haws business as soon as possible. Just by selling a few sticks of candied haws, Fong's dream of marrying a concubine and buying a village would probably only be realized in his next life. Li Yi felt that he was born to work hard. He was living a good life as the husband of the village. He had food, drinks, and maids to serve him every day. His life was extremely comfortable. However, he had to look for trouble and lead Fong and the others to a well-off life. He obviously yearned for a pig's life, but in the end he was as tired as a dog. This was all his own doing. When he walked out of the room, he saw the little maid sitting in the yard. She pouted and kept scratching the mosquito bite on her arm. Hearing the son-in-law calling her from a distance at the door, the girl hurriedly stood up, turned her head and asked, "Son-in-law, what's the matter?" Come here, come here." He waved to the little maid and brought her into the room. He poured some floral water on his hand and wiped it on the mosquito bite on her arm. He asked, "How do you feel? Is it still itchy?" "No, it's not itchy anymore." The afterglow of the setting sun shone into the room through the window. The little maid rolled up her sleeves, revealing her white arms. She lowered her head and spoke softly. Her pretty face was rosy and beautiful. Chapter 60. At present, this newly developed floral water could not be put on the market immediately. Li Yi walked out of the room thinking about possible improvement plans. When he passed by the kitchen, he suddenly stopped and looked inside with some doubts. Just now he seemed to have forgotten something. While he was puzzled, the next moment, Li Yi saw a familiar figure coming out of the kitchen. Lu Rui's pretty face was flushed, her eyes were blurred, and she walked unsteadily. Li Yi could smell a strong smell of alcohol from a distance. His face changed slightly and he quickly rushed into the kitchen. When he saw the empty porcelain bottle on the table, a few black lines suddenly appeared on his face. Looking back at Lu Rui's appearance, he knew without guessing that she must have drunk all the wine just now. I don't know what her alcohol tolerance is. Even Fong got drunk in one gulp of that kind of alcohol, but she can still stand well. When Li Yi thought so in his heart, he looked up and saw that the figure swayed a few times and then fell head first. A moment later, looking at Lu Rui, who fell into her arms and her body became soft, Li Yi couldn't help but twitch the corner of his mouth. Xiao Huan. The next moment, Li Yi's voice came from the kitchen to the yard. The little maid hurriedly ran out of the room. After running into the kitchen, she saw the scene in front of her and her pretty face showed astonishment. Young master, second miss. What happened? What are you doing? Come and help. Li Yi glanced at Xiao Huan and said impatiently. He really didn't have the experience of taking care of a drunk woman. Moreover, he couldn't do anything. Otherwise, when Lu Rui woke up and misunderstood something, he was afraid that she would directly slash him with a sword. Oh. The little maid responded. Although there was still some doubt on her pretty face, she still walked over quickly. The floral water had been successfully prepared, but before it was officially sold, it needed to be given a resounding name. Let's call it floral water. It seemed a bit too vulgar. As a cultured person, this idea was immediately rejected by Li Yi. Why don't we call them the Six Gods? When Fong, Lu Rui and Xiao Huan heard Li Yi say this name, they were all stunned. Six Gods? What the hell was this? What's wrong? Is there a problem? Li Yi frowned as he looked at the three of them. What was with their expressions? So what if there were six gods? He actually looked down on the name Lucian. It was known that this was the most famous brand of toilet water in the future. In his original world, the name Lucian could be said to be known by everyone. Ahem, young master, there's something that I don't know if I should say. After a moment, it was Fong who let out a dry cough and was the first to break the silence. Then don't say it. Li Yi glanced at him and said. He was obviously a big and rough man who did not know how to read. Yet he insisted on talking about literature and saying, I don't know if I should say it. Was this something that Fong could say? Fong nodded and said, then I'll say it. This name really doesn't sound good. Li Yi looked up at Fong. He clearly told him not to say it just now. Did this guy not understand what he said? Fong looked at Li Yi with a troubled face. Under normal circumstances he would not object to Li Yi, but this time, he felt that calling it Fong's toilet water was 10,000 times better than the six gods that the young master had just said. Xiao Huan, what do you think? Li Yi turned to look at Xiao Huan and asked. Fong was becoming more and more dishonest. He should learn more from Xiao Huan. No matter what, she would never object to his opinion. Young master, I also don't think it sounds good. The little maid bowed her head and whispered as she rubbed the corner of her clothes. Li Yi, I think it's better to call it Rui Du. At this moment, Lu Rui suddenly said. This name is good. After being stunned for a moment, Fong immediately nodded fiercely. Obviously, he agreed with Lu Rui's proposal. I also think this name is good. Xiao Huan also nodded and said. To be honest, when Lu Rui said this name, Li Yi also had a feeling that his eyes lit up. Toilet water had many effects, such as repelling mosquitoes and relieving itching, cooling and removing heat, sterilizing and disinfecting. Its functions were so powerful that it could be called an indispensable artifact in daily life. It could meet all kinds of daily needs. It was most appropriate to call it Rui Du. However, he looked up at the slightly expectant expression on Lu Rui's face. On second thought, the way he looked at her suddenly became strange. Rui Du, when she thought of this name, did she really not have any selfish motives? Everything about the floral dew was her own credit. Why should it be named after her? Was it a privilege to be beautiful? According to his contribution to the toilet water of this world, it was most appropriate to call it Li Yi Du. Among the four people, 3 people's opinions were unified. Li Yi was currently behind by a big score of 3-1. How about calling it 6 Gods Ruidu? He looked up at the 3 people and asked tentatively. Seeing Xiao Huan's strange expression, Lu Rui and Fong had a look of disgust. Li Yi thought about it and asked again, how about Rui 6 Gods Do? The matter of the name of the toilet water was so happily finalized. As a good young man who had received a good modern education, Li Yi finally decided to follow democracy and gave up his insistence on 6 gods. He decided to name the upcoming toilet water as Rui Du. Of course, for Fong's betrayal, Li Yi also indirectly expressed his dissatisfaction. The way he was dissatisfied was when Fong talked to him about life ideals and revealed that he would make a lot of money in the future, build a big house and marry a beautiful concubine. He did not remind Fong that his wife was standing behind him, planning to call him home for dinner. Li Yi did not know whether Fong had eaten that day, but in the next 2 days he saw that his walking was a little abnormal. He did not know if it was because he had been kneeling on the washboard for a long time. Originally he wanted to re-educate the little maid, but when he saw her standing in front of him with her head bowed and pitifully rubbing the corner of her clothes, Li Yi could not say a word. In the next few days, Li Yi once again gave the naughty children a long vacation. Almost all his energy was put on the improvement of the distillation device and the improvement of the toilet water formula. After consulting a large number of materials and documents in the library, there was obvious progress in both the distillation efficiency and the improvement of the formula. As the autumn grew, it was already the middle of August. It was getting closer to the first Mid-Autumn festival that Li Yi would spend in this world. Chapter 61. In this world, the Mid-Autumn Festival was still one of the most important festivals on the 15th of August every year. The Mid-Autumn Festival, which implied reunion, was a relatively sensitive day for Li Yi. It was easy to evoke some dusty memories in the bottom of his heart. But now he had learned to hide those emotions in the bottom of his heart, and it would not be easily seen by others. Tomorrow was the Mid-Autumn Festival that Xiao Huan had been looking forward to for a long time. For a simple-minded girl, every festival would be looked forward to a long time ago. After Li Yi taught her to count, the little servant girl would count the days with her fingers. Today Fong and the others did not go to the street to sell candied haws. It was a festive festival and they had to take a holiday to relax. In the past, when the family conditions were poor, every festival, they would eat a porridge with a handful of rice grains, and it was considered a festival. Now there was a lot of money coming in every day. Even if they ate rice and meat every day, there was no psychological pressure. The economic base determined the superstructure. When the family's situation was better, the pursuit was naturally higher. When Fong and the others returned from outside yesterday, they had already bought wine and meat and other things, preparing for the Mid-Autumn Festival celebration. Li Yi looked at the things they sent yesterday and actually saw mooncakes. It was called mooncakes, but in fact it was dough with fillings. After picking one up and tasting it, Li Yi suddenly missed the taste of the 5-kernel mooncakes in the future. Walking on the wide street of Qing and Prefecture with Xiao Huan, the little servant girl blinked her big eyes curiously and looked around. She felt that everything she saw was so strange. But Li Yi's heart was thinking about other things. In the past few days he had used all kinds of methods to improve the distillation of alcohol. He had also made great improvements to the formula of floral water. Soon it could be officially produced. Floral water was different from candied haws. Li Yi's initial positioning for it was to go the high-end route. After all, the cost of distilling alcohol was not small. A few jars of wine could make a small bottle of floral water. If the price was set low, Li Yi would lose a lot of money without selling a few bottles. This brought about a new problem. Since it was decided that the floral dew would appear as a high-class image from the beginning, it naturally couldn't be like selling candied haws. Li Yi imagined that Fong was holding 2 bottles of floral dew in his hands and selling them on the street. He randomly grabbed a passerby and said mysteriously, "Brother, do you need Rui dew?" This situation, no matter how he thought about it, felt like he was selling porn or Indian divine oil. Obviously, the roadside stalls were far from meeting the requirements of pretentiousness. If they wanted to do the floral water business for a long time, they might have to add liquor, perfume and soap in the future. It was essential to have their own shop in the prefecture. However, the difficulty of renting a shop in the bustling area of Qing, An prefectural city was no less than opening a shop in the commercial streets of a first-tier city in the future. Just 1 year's rent was an astronomical price for some people. Li Yi specifically inquired about it. Even if the shop was not in the most prosperous area of the prefecture, the annual rent would be 70 or 80 taels of silver. If the shop was slightly renovated, it would cost at least 100 taels of silver. This was a very embarrassing thing for Li Yi at present. His entire net worth was only 100 taels of silver. If he rented the shop, there would be no money to buy liquor and the materials needed to make the floral dew. But if he didn't rent without the shop, how could he sell the floral dew? Fong and the others naturally wouldn't consider these problems. If Li Yi didn't say it, he was afraid that he would sell the floral dew like candied haws. Anyway, in his eyes, these two things were treasures that could make money. There was no big difference. The matter of money couldn't be rushed at the moment. He would find a way to solve it after he went back. Xiao Huan held the 2 pieces of cloth that her son-in-law bought for her to make new clothes. Her eyes were curved into crescent moons and her little face was full of joy. In the past there was no spare money in the family to buy cloth. Most of the clothes that Xiao Huan wore were worn by Lu Rui. Lu Rui's figure was extremely tall. Xiao Huan couldn't wear her clothes at all. Lu Rui was taller than Xiao Huan, but the difference was not too big. Xiao Huan could wear her clothes with a little modification. In addition to those rich families, most ordinary families were like this. They took turns to wear the same clothes. Li Yi also saw that the clothes that Xiao Huan wore were all patched, so he specially brought her out today. At this time there were still no ready-made clothes shops. If you wanted to make clothes, you either bought a few pieces of cloth and went back to make it yourself or find a special tailor to make it. Of course, the price of the latter would be a little higher. Generally, poor families would choose the first way to make clothes. After learning about these things, Li Yi was slightly tempted. If he opened a ready-made clothes shop here, would he make a lot of money? Of course, at the moment he could only think about it. He still had a lot of things to do. He didn't have the energy to take care of more things. When it was almost noon, Xiao Huan randomly found a roadside stall to eat something. Not to mention, although the roadside food did not look that fancy, the taste was actually not bad and the price was also very cheap. The present was not like the future, where one did not have to worry about gutter oil when eating at roadside stalls. Li Yi did not know if it was because of their good looks, but he realized that the stall owner actually gave him and Xiao Huan more noodles than the customers around them. This made him feel a little gratified. After all, him in the past had never thought that one day he could actually use his good looks to take advantage of others. After eating, they strolled on the streets for a while and bought some things. Because it was approaching the Mid-Autumn Festival, there were more people on the streets than usual. It had to be said that the quality of the beauties in ancient times was really not bad. In this era where double eyelids could not be drawn, all the beauties were pure natural. They wore light makeup. Along the way, Li Yi saw many of them. If it was in the future, they would not need to change their clothes to be able to hold up a period drama. Of course, his little servant girl could also be considered a little beauty. Although she was a little young and had a little baby fat on her face, but after a few years she would definitely grow into a beauty. Towards the resistance of beauties, the current Li Yi was much stronger than in his previous life. The 3 beauties in his family swayed in front of him all day, which directly caused Li Yi's resistance towards beauties to increase greatly. Even if he met a beautiful woman on the street, he would only glance at her with an appreciative gaze, and then turn to look at other beauties. When he passed by a certain part of the street, he saw a group of people gathered there making a lot of noise. Li Yi did not have the mood to watch the show, but Xiao Huan looked curiously in that direction. But when she saw Li Yi walking straight past, she hurriedly retracted her gaze and quickly followed him. He actually took out 100 taels of silver. This is a little too generous. Chapter 62. Li Yi suddenly stopped in his tracks. The young maidservant was just about to catch up to him and was caught off guard when she bumped into him. She rubbed her chest in pain. When she raised her head, she found that the son-in-law had turned his head and was looking in the direction of the crowd. 100 taels? Li Yi muttered this number. If he had heard correctly, the 2 people talking on the outskirts of the crowd had just said these 3 words. For the current Li Yi, anything related to money was a sensitive word. Even if they were separated by a distance of several zhang, it would not escape his ears. He, who had originally not planned on watching the show, immediately walked over to the crowd with quick steps. "Dare I ask, brothers, what is happening here and why is everyone gathered here?" Li Yi first bowed to the two people who had just spoken and then asked with a smile. The two people were chatting happily and were naturally displeased to be interrupted. But when they turned their heads and saw that the person standing in front of them was also a scholar, the displeasure on their faces immediately disappeared. One of them smiled and replied, "Brother, you may not know, but today a few of the poetry clubs in Qing'an Prefecture are competing in poetry in Drunken Fragrance Tower. The winner can participate in the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet tomorrow. I'm afraid that not long after, there will be excellent work circulating." Li Yi's clothing, no matter how you looked at it, looked like a scholar. Perhaps it was because of this that the two men dressed in Confucian robes were very friendly towards him. Li Yi had no interest in poetry clubs or poetry meets. This friend had talked for a long time but still had not gotten to the main point. Li Yi decided to give him a reminder. A smile appeared on his face and he pretended to ask carelessly, "Brothers, the 100 taels of silver you just mentioned. Oh, that 100 taels of silver is the prize for this competition. At the end it will be given to the winner of the poetry meet." The other person paused for a moment and then explained. For scholars like them, the main point should be this poetry competition. Money was a worldly possession. The 100 taels of silver was not the main point of their attention. A scholar should treat money as dirt. However, as a fake scholar, this was the focus of Li Yi's attention. It was 100 taels of silver. If he won, he could take it away with him. In this way, wouldn't he be able to pay the rent for the shop? These 100 taels of silver were obviously tailor-made for him. "Thank you, brothers." Li Yi smiled and cupped his hands at the two of them. He then looked at the servant girl standing behind him and said, "Xiao Huan, let's go in." Xiao Huan nodded, followed behind Li Yi, with a look that said wherever the son-in-law was, she would be there. "Brother, please wait." Li Yi had just taken 2 steps when a voice suddenly came from behind him. He turned around and looked suspiciously at the young scholar. "Is there anything else, brother? Do you have an invitation?" "Invitation?" Li Yi's expression froze. "What invitation?" The young scholar explained, "The Drunken Fragrance restaurant has been booked today. Only those with an invitation can enter. That is why we were refused entry." "So we can't go in?" Li Yi said with a face of disappointment. He seemed to see the 100 taels of silver in his hands fly out of his arms. "That is not entirely the case." The scholar pointed to the front and said, "You can go in without an invitation. However, you need to guess the riddles correctly." Li Yi felt a little depressed as he watched this man speak so slowly. He was so wishy-washy and not manly at all. If he had something to say, he should have said it quickly. If he only said half a sentence at a time, it would be easy for others to misunderstand. If that is the case, then guess the riddles before going in. Guessing riddles was something that Li Yi had played since he was young. He had much more experience than these ancient people and did not need to cheat at all. The two men looked at each other and said with a wry smile, "These riddles are problems that were not solved during last year's Lantern Festival. If they were so easy to solve, we wouldn't be waiting outside the door. Whether we can guess it or not, we will know once we try." Li Yi smiled and held Xiao Huan's hand as they walked to the front. At the front of the crowd, people were surrounding a few red lanterns and arguing endlessly. At the bottom of the lanterns were white strips of cloth with riddles written on them. "A white snake crosses the river, a red sun above its head." Li Yi looked at the strips of cloth at the bottom of the lanterns. His expression did not change, but he was cursing in his heart. What kind of stupid riddles was this? There were no hints and it did not say whether it was a word puzzle or a guess. How could people guess it? Wasn't this deliberately making things difficult for people? At the side, some people guessed that the answer was boat, while others guessed Dan. However, the manservant standing at the side did not respond. Obviously, they did not guess the correct answer. Li Yi originally wanted to rely on his intelligence to guess riddles, but now he could not count on it. Cheating was the right way to go. With a thought, a thick book of ancient and modern lantern riddles appeared in his mind. Li Yi did not believe that this book, which was as thick as an encyclopedia, would not have this stupid lantern riddle. Searching according to the first word, white, snake. A white snake crosses the river, a red sun above its head. Found it. In just 10 seconds, a smile appeared on Li Yi's face. He waved to the manservant and waited for him to come over. He smiled and said, "A white snake crosses the river, a red sun above its head. The answer to this riddle is oil lamp." The surrounding crowd was stunned at first and then immediately burst into an uproar. What oil lamp? Even if it is a blind guess, it should be an accurate one. Exactly what does the white snake, red sun and oil lamp have to do with each other? If you have guessed it, get out of the way. Don't block the way. A few people were not polite with their words. They had racked their brains for so long and still could not guess it correctly. Why was a newcomer joining in the fun? Young master is very talented. The answer to this riddle is the oil lamp. The manservant was stunned for a moment. Then a surprised expression appeared on his face as he immediately bowed and said, "What? He actually guessed it correctly. Why is it an oil lamp? I know. The wick is the white snake and the flame, isn't it the red sun?" This riddle was actually very common. However, because there were no hints, the range of guesses was too wide. If one did not have a flash of inspiration, it would be very difficult to think of the oil lamp. When Li Yi said the answer to the riddle, people quickly figured it out. It turned out that the answer was actually so simple. Many people immediately beat their chests and stamped their feet. While sighing at this scholar's good luck, they were also very regretful that they did not think of this earlier. The two scholars who were chatting with Li Yi looked at this scene with their mouths agape. It was hard to imagine that he actually guessed it correctly. "Can I go in now?" Li Yi looked at the manservant and asked. "Young master, please." The manservant hurriedly extended his hand and made an inviting gesture. Li Yi waved to the young girl behind him and said, "Xiao Huan, let's go in." The young servant immediately nodded. The young master was really amazing. He even guessed the riddle that so many people could not. Xiao Huan saw the oil lamp every night and did not think of it. A pleasant smile appeared on her face. Just as she was about to follow Li Yi in, the manservant quickly caught up and blocked the two of them. With a troubled expression, he said, "Young master, you can only go in alone." Why? Li Yi looked at him and asked with a frown. Hearing this, Xiao Huan immediately grabbed the corner of Li Yi's clothes worriedly. Xiao Huan did not want to be separated from the young master. Because young master only solved one riddle. "According to our rules, only you can go in alone," the manservant explained patiently. Chapter 63. The servant's explanation was very clear. This place implemented a one-person, one-vote system. If Li Yi wanted to bring Xiao Huan in, he had to guess another riddle. The matter of money was important. Naturally, he could not break other people's rules. Li Yi walked back to the front of the lanterns. There seemed to be an invisible aura around him. The surrounding people all made way for him. A black dragon on the wall, covered with 10,000 golden stars. Other than this sentence, there was still no other explanation. The crowd guessed for a long time but still could not guess the answer. At this time, almost everyone's gaze was on Li Yi. Of course, most of them had the mentality of watching a joke. The first time may have been a coincidence, the second time, would he still be as lucky as before? After a while, Li Yi spoke again. "The answer to this riddle is pole scale." With the ancient and modern lantern riddles in his hands, what riddle could he not guess? "Congratulations, young master. Now young master can bring this lady in." The servant's following actions proved that the answer Li Yi gave was correct. After Li Yi spoke, a few people's faces showed confusion. Very quickly it turned into understanding. "I see. Comparing the pole scale to a black dragon, then the pole scale is 10,000 golden stars. Ashamed to think that I have read so many books, but I can't even see through these two little riddles. I am so ashamed." Actually, something like guessing lantern riddles to a certain extent had nothing to do with literary talent or profound knowledge. It only relied on a flash of inspiration or a cheating device like Li Yi's. This kind of person who did not even delineate the scope of the riddles, and only placed one sentence there for people to guess blindly, was not a good person. Most likely, his intention was to deliberately make things difficult for people. At this time, the surrounding people's gazes towards Li Yi had changed. Guessing one might be a fluke, but to be able to guess the second so easily, the possibility of it being a fluke was not high. It could only mean this handsome scholar in front of them most likely had some ability. Very quickly, Li Yi used his actions to prove to them how correct these people's thoughts were. He, who had originally planned to bring Xiao Huan in, glanced at the two scholars who had just enthusiastically introduced him, and immediately felt that it was a little impolite to just leave like that. He walked over and smiled to the two. "Brothers, why don't we go in together?" The expressions on the two people's faces froze, and before they could regain their senses, Li Yi had already walked to the two remaining lanterns, raised his head to look and read, "The bright moon half rests under the cloud's feet, withered flowers fall before the horse's hooves." The answer to this riddle should be the word bear. As soon as he said that, everyone looked at him as if they were looking at a monster. How could they tell that it was the word bear? There was no connection at all. Li Yi did not stop because of the uproar, his gaze was already on the last lantern. Not long after he opened his mouth again, 2 rows of distant trees stand on the side of the mountain, a small boat and a leaf flow horizontally. This is also a word riddle. The answer to the riddle is the word intelligence. There was already no one around to speak, and their gazes towards him were filled with a strange expression. Undeniably he had guessed the first 2 riddles, but for the last 2, what was he guessing? The bright moon half rests under the cloud's feet, withered flowers fall before the horse's hooves. What did this verse have to do with the word bear at all? 2 rows of distant trees stand on the side of the mountain, a small boat and a leaf flow horizontally. Where did he see the word intelligence? However, when the crowd glanced over, they saw that the servant was standing there in a daze, and his expression was as if he had seen a ghost. Their expressions also gradually changed. Could it be he had really guessed correctly? "Everyone, please." After an unknown amount of time, the servant finally regained his senses and involuntarily swallowed a mouthful of saliva. He respectfully made a gesture towards Li Yi and the others to invite them in. He knew better than anyone that these lantern riddles were a gimmick created by those people to attract others. Without any hints, no one would be able to guess them. But the truth was, these extremely difficult lantern riddles were all solved by the scholar in front of him. If it was just one riddle it would have been fine, but he just had to solve all the riddles. This was clearly ruining the place. However, with so many people staring at him, he naturally could not say that he was going back on his words. Even though he was shocked beyond belief, he still respectfully invited Li Yi and the others to enter. At this moment, those who had painstakingly guessed the riddles for a long time could no longer describe the feelings in their hearts. He had actually guessed all of them correctly. He had only pondered over each riddle for a few breaths of time. In comparison, what had they been doing for such a long period of time? Moreover, if it was an ordinary person, guessing 1 riddle was enough. Guessing 2 was also forgivable. But what was the point of guessing so many? If you took up all the spots, how could you leave a way out for others? Seeing the scholar and the others enter the restaurant, the crowd looked at the lanterns that the servant had already taken down. This meant that they would no longer have the chance to enter. Instantly they wanted to cry but had no tears. At this moment, Li Yi, Xiao Huan and the 2 scholars who had yet to regain their senses had already entered the restaurant. "Thank you, brother." After the 2 of them regained their senses, they immediately cupped their fists and thanked Li Yi. Today in this restaurant, other than those participating in the competition, naturally there were other people who were also invited. After all, since ancient times there was no first place in literature. If there were only those from the poetry clubs, it was likely that no one would accept the other and they would not be able to argue who was better by the next day. These invited people would all evaluate the poems that had been produced today and use that to determine the winner. And if it were not for Li Yi, the 2 of them would not even be qualified to enter this place. These scholars were always thanking one another and it was not interesting at all. After waving his hand, Li Yi began to look at the situation in front of him. The space in this restaurant was much larger than he had imagined. Just the hall on the first floor alone had about a dozen people. As for the upper floor, there were also figures moving about. Even with so many people accommodating so many people, it still seemed very spacious. On the table at the side, there were some vegetables, fruits, pastries and other snacks. They looked quite exquisite and could be used as dessert after the meal. Just when Li Yi was about to taste a piece of fruit and vegetable, a few steps away, an extremely beautiful woman spread out a square handkerchief in her hand and distributed the exquisite pastries to the women beside her. Li Yi sniffed and his expression suddenly changed. He looked in the direction of the fragrance. "The service here is quite good," Even a maid is so beautiful. Hey, the pastries in her hand look delicious. Li Yi was surprised and sighed in his heart. Then he quickly walked over. There were originally only a few pieces of the pastries. After being distributed by the women, there were only 2 pieces left. Li Yi was afraid that the last 2 pieces would be taken away by others if he was too late. Thus he quickened his pace again and walked to the pretty maid. Then he imitated those women and stretched out his hand. Looking at the slender and fair palm that suddenly appeared in front of her, the pretty maid was slightly stunned. She raised her head and looked at Li Yi with a blank expression. At the same time, the women around her also showed astonished expressions. That brother actually knows Miss Wan? Not far away, the 2 scholars brought in by Li Yi looked at each other and murmured. Chapter 64. Young Master, you want this? The pretty maidservant looked at Li Yi with a blank expression. After being stunned for a moment, she pointed at the pastry in her hand and asked with some uncertainty. Her voice was soft, extremely pleasant to the ears. No matter how beautiful other maids were, it had nothing to do with him. Li Yi was only interested in the fragrant pastry in her hand. Seeing that she was so decisive in distributing the pastry to the other girls, when it was him, the other party seemed to be unwilling, he felt slightly dissatisfied. Could it be that this beautiful maid had the thought of valuing females over males? Li Yi looked at her and nodded with absolute certainty. He thought that if she rejected him, he would definitely find her leader to complain about her. Futile thinking must not be tolerated. That girl was stunned for a moment and raised her head to look at the scholar in front of her. Seeing that he did not seem to be joking, she really handed over the silk handkerchief in her hand. Xiaohuan, come and try this. Li Yi stretched out his hand and took the remaining 2 pastry from the silk handkerchief. He turned his head and beckoned to the young maid. He had never been a person who ate alone. This pastry smelled pretty good. Coincidentally, Xiaohuan liked sweet food. He had to let her have a taste. After walking 2 steps, he suddenly turned his head and said, "Thank you," to the maid who was standing dumbfounded on the spot. Then he turned and left. The maid stared at Li Yi's back and the confusion on her face deepened. "Ruoqing, you know that scholar?" A girl beside her asked with some confusion. The surprised expression on her face was still there. The girl called Ruoqing shook her head and said, "I have never seen him before." What? When the other girls beside her heard this, they all revealed an extremely surprised expression. Then why did he? This scholar is so strange. Yes, I have never seen such a person. Even if Ruoqing tried very hard to recall, she did not have any impression of that scholar. After a moment she finally confirmed that she did not know him before. But if they didn't know each other, then his action of asking for the osmanthus cake just now was a little hard to see through. The etiquette between men and women had been developed very well in this era. Even men who were familiar with her would stand at attention and bow to her when they saw her. As for reaching out to ask for the osmanthus cake, it was impossible for them to do such a thing. Therefore, when that unfamiliar scholar reached out to her, Wan Ruoqing felt somewhat at a loss and didn't know what to do. Even now, she still couldn't figure out why she had reached out her hand just now. "Ruoqing, I remember that Zuimo told us to leave 2 pieces for her. She likes the osmanthus cake you make the most." After a while, a woman beside the pretty woman came back to her senses and seemed to have thought of something. She turned to look at her and said with a strange expression, "Ah." When the beautiful woman named Wan Ruoqing heard this, she couldn't help but let out a soft cry, and a remorseful expression appeared on her pretty face. At this time, everyone's eyes couldn't help but look at the scholar who was talking and laughing with the pretty girl not far away, and the expression on their faces was extremely strange. Li Yi still didn't know that in the eyes of these strange women, he had completely lost his gentlemanly demeanor. Perhaps he would be labeled as shameless. The taste of the nameless cake just now made his eyes light up. He thought in his heart that he would ask the maidservant where she bought the cake later. When he was planning this in his heart, he suddenly felt something. Looking back, he found that the beautiful maidservant and the women around her were looking at him with strange eyes. Seeing this, Li Yi couldn't help but be slightly stunned, and was a little surprised in his heart. Although the cake was indeed delicious, they didn't have to be so distressed, right? He shook his head and stopped thinking about these things. He turned to look at Xiaohuan and asked with a smile, "How is it?" Is the cake delicious? The young maidservant's eyes had already turned into crescent moons. To her, the happiest thing was to have such a cake to eat every day. So this brother is actually acquainted with Lady Wan and the talented women of the Yuning society. My apologies, my apologies. At this time, the two scholars who had just come in with Li Yi walked over and looked at Li Yi with envy. Who is Lady Wan? Hearing this, Li Yi was first stunned, then he asked with some confusion. He had never even heard of Lady Wan from the Yuning society. Brother, don't joke around. The two looked at Li Yi and spoke with strange expressions. Before waiting for Li Yi to speak, one of them spoke again. Although Lady Wan is an outstanding actress, her literary talent is so great that even we cannot compare. Even those famous scholars would not look down on her because of her identity. This brother is acquainted with Lady Wan. This is not a shameful matter, why hide it? This time, Li Yi was really a little confused. The two of them had said so much, but he still did not understand what they were saying. He really did not know this Lady Wan. As for discriminating against outstanding actresses, how could there be such a thing? The outstanding actresses of ancient times were equivalent to the actors of the future. The difference was that the status of the two was worlds apart. The latter often enjoyed the treatment of the moon surrounded by the stars, while the former had a lower status. They belonged to the untouchables outside of the scholars, farmers, and merchants. In the eyes of the ancients, their status was even lower than dog shit. There was an old saying, prostitutes are heartless and entertainers are unjust. The entertainers in this saying referred to outstanding actresses. This showed how much the ancients looked down on this profession. But what did this have to do with him? He was a well-educated youth of the new era. His three views were righteous and he advocated equality for everyone. Why did he look down on outstanding actresses? If it was in the future, they would all be celebrities. They were rare. Who is this Lady Wan you are talking about? Li Yi looked at the two of them and asked sincerely. This time it was the two of them who were confused. They pointed at the beautiful servant girl not far away and said, "That is Lady Wan." What? Li Yi's eyes widened and he almost blurted out, "Isn't that the servant girl of Drunken Fragrance Brothel? How could Lady Wan be a servant girl? Moreover, aren't the women beside her the talented ladies of Yuning society?" A scholar looked at Li Yi and said with some astonishment. Li Yi held on to the table beside him and felt a little confused. So, that person just now wasn't a servant girl here? That pastry wasn't the restaurant's buffet either. She brought it here herself? No wonder she and the women around her looked at him so strangely. After all this time they all knew each other. In an instant, Li Yi felt his face turn red and he felt unwell. Even in the future, his skin was not thick enough to ask a stranger for a snack on the street. But just now he actually did it. Most importantly, the other party really gave it to him. He involuntarily raised his head and looked in that direction. Coincidentally, the woman's gaze also looked over. The moment their eyes met, Li Yi's expression was extremely awkward. Chapter 65. At this moment, even the matter of the 100 taels of silver was temporarily thrown to the back of Li Yi's mind. He couldn't blame anyone else for making such a mistake. He could only blame himself for not being able to control his mouth. In his previous life, Li Yi was a moderate foodie. He had a great desire for good food and had eaten all kinds of famous snacks. After coming to this world, in a situation where food was extremely scarce compared to his previous life, it was not easy for him to come across a pastry that could arouse his appetite. His foodie heart began to lose control. And then, it was embarrassing. Encountering such an embarrassing situation, Li Yi's gaze was already too embarrassed to look over there. As for the women, after experiencing this small episode, they finally put away their curiosity about Li Yi. They gathered in the small space that belonged to them and began to talk in low voices. After all, today's small poetry competition was what they needed to focus on. Because today's victory or defeat directly affected whether or not they had the right to participate in tomorrow's mid-autumn poetry competition. For the many scholars of Qing and Fu, this was a kind of recognition of strength and status. Although they were women, they also wanted to compete with the men. Today we have Ruoqing here. The other poetry clubs are nothing to worry about. Only the Eastern Li and White Dew poetry clubs cannot be underestimated. Su Wentian and Feng Zhou are both very good at mid-autumn poems. We still have to be careful. A slightly older woman looked at the two poetry clubs and spoke in a slightly serious tone. Su Wentin is one thing, but that Feng Zhou's poetry is extraordinary. The poem he wrote on the 7th day of the lunar month actually entered the top 10. If it wasn't for Sister Ruoqing, then he would have won first place at the poetry competition. Another girl with an oval face said. Wan Ruoqing smiled and said, "What does this have to do with me?" "What do you mean it has nothing to do with you?" The girl argued with a smile. "If it wasn't for Sister Ruoqing taking out the Immortal Magpie Bridge, then wouldn't the first place have been taken by that Fong guy?" Immortal Magpie Bridge. The girl's words seemed to make Ruoqing sink into some kind of memory. A look of regret appeared on her pretty face. Su Wentian cannot be underestimated. The older woman looked at the young girl, shook her head and said, "In terms of Qixi poetry, Su Wentian might not be as good as Feng Zhou, but the styles of Qixi and Mid-Autumn poetry are completely different. Feng Zhou's Qixi poetry might not be better than his Mid-Autumn poetry. In last year's Mid-Autumn poetry meet he lost to Su Wentian." What are you afraid of? We have Sister Ruoqing." The girl said disapprovingly, "Sister Ruoqing, go and see if there are any more sky prayer lanterns falling outside. Maybe you can pick up another Mid-Autumn festival poem that will scare them to death." When the women heard this, they smiled helplessly. A poem of this level was enough to be passed down through the ages. How could it be picked up so easily? At this moment, as if remembering something, the young lady suddenly said, "Do you guys think that the scholar who composed the Immortal Magpie Bridge will also participate in the poetry meet tomorrow?" As soon as the girl said this, Ruoqing's eyes suddenly lit up. "I'm afraid not." The older woman shook her head and said, "Once the Immortal Magpie Bridge appeared, there were no more Qixi poetry poems. The #1 scholar of Qing and Prefecture, who had always been an expert in Qixi poetry poems, tore up his own poem and said that he would never compose another Qixi poetry poem in his life. After that night, countless people searched for the scholar named Li Yi, but no one saw him. Could it be that the poem was really composed by an immortal from heaven?" The girl's eyes flashed with an inexplicable light as she murmured, "Silly girl, you only know how to think. How can there be an immortal in this world?" A woman beside her lightly knocked on her head and said unhappily. The older woman seemed to think of something and suddenly turned to look at Ruoqing and asked, "Right, didn't Ruoqing have news of that scholar named Li Yi? What happened after that?" Wan Ruoqing shook her head and said, "Drunken Emo and I went to ask the scholar who painted for her. The scholar said that the painting wasn't made by him and that he only met that person once." The older woman nodded and said, "I've seen that painting before. It's hard to imagine that the art of painting could reach such a level. The so-called 3 parts of wood is nothing more than this, isn't it? That scholar named Li Yi can be said to be a master of both poetry and painting. If I can meet him, it would be a great regret in my life." Wan Ruoqing smiled and said, "Drunken Emo has been hugging that painting and studying it these days and has had a small breakthrough. She talks about it all day long, probably hoping to see that person tomorrow." Of course, Li Yi didn't know that this Immortal Magpie Bridge had won him the hearts of countless women. He already had many female fans in this world who saw him as a soulmate. It was likely that with just a word from him, there would be countless girls who would offer themselves to him, pledging their lives to him. In this world, don't underestimate the attractiveness of those scholars to women. Those famous scholars were almost equivalent to the Korean oppas in the hearts of the die-hard young girls in the future. And Li Yi was the most popular type. His influence was evident. Of course, Li Yi still didn't know about these things. Because of the blunder just now, his mood wasn't too good. If it wasn't for the fact that he really couldn't bear to part with the 100 taels of silver, he probably would have left with his servant girl. He had never done such an embarrassing thing in his 2 lives. So embarrassing. The servant girl on the side saw that Li Yi wasn't in a good mood and said softly, "Young master, how about we go home?" "Wait a little longer." Li Yi shook his head and said. He had already lost face and urgently needed 100 taels of silver to comfort himself. So even if he would be embarrassed when he saw those girls, Li Yi still didn't plan to leave this place. What stupid poetry gathering, why hasn't it started yet? Li Yi thought gloomily and stood up to find someone to ask. When he walked to the door, 2 figures walked in from outside. The beautiful girl in front had just stepped through the door when she saw a young man dressed like a scholar walking in her direction. Her footsteps suddenly stopped and the expression on her face froze for a moment. Then anger emerged. "It's you." A rebuke that was suppressing her anger suddenly came from her mouth. The 15 or 16-year-old girl behind the girl was also stunned. She didn't know what had made the young miss so angry. Li Yi was also stunned. He raised his head and looked at the unfamiliar girl in front of him. He was a little confused. "Is she talking to me? But I don't know her." "Lecture." The woman pointed a slender, jade-like finger at him. Her pretty face was filled with anger. Li Yi was really a little confused. "What lecture? Do we know each other?" The meaning of lecture seems to be the hoodlums and perverts of the future. Scolding someone the first time they met. Is this girl crazy? Chapter 66. The beautiful lady's eyes were wide open, pointing at Li Yi and cursing lecture. Her face was full of resentment, looking as though her innocence had been violated. Those who didn't know the truth might really think that Li Yi had done something outrageous to her. At least that was what Li Yi and the two scholars beside her thought. The two of them stared blankly at this scene as though they had been struck by lightning. They were completely stunned. Although they hadn't been in contact with Li Yi for a long time, his performance of solving the riddles outside the door just now had already deeply impressed them. Looking at his mannerisms, they could see that he was quite a gentleman, and the reason why they were qualified to enter was all because of his help. Such a person, no matter how they looked at it, didn't seem like a lecher. Of course, compared to their suspicions of this righteous brother's character, they were even more surprised by the identity of the lady. The leading courtesan of the Jade's courtyard. How many people wanted to get intimate with her, but no one had ever gotten their wish. Lady Zhuamo, who was pursued by countless men, was actually taken advantage of by someone? If this was known by those scholars who were interested in her, who knew what would happen? The two of them opened their mouths and felt that their throats were a little dry. When they looked at Li Yi again, their eyes couldn't help but reveal a strong sense of envy. Because he had done something that many men, including them, dreamed of. And standing behind Li Yi, Xiao Huan, who also didn't know what was going on, also looked at the lady in confusion, still wondering what lecture meant. And what was strange was that this beautiful lady in front of her, why did she feel a sense of familiarity? The little servant girl thought for a long time, but still couldn't figure out where she had seen her before, and couldn't help but feel even more puzzled. At this time, Li Yi also finally realized that things weren't going well. A normal woman definitely wouldn't point at a stranger's nose and scold lecture. Looking at this lady's appearance, it didn't seem like she was mentally unstable. What made him feel even more guilty was that this lady in front of him actually gave him a vague sense of familiarity. This beautiful face, he seemed to have seen it somewhere before. However, he had only been in this world for a short period of time. He had spent most of his time in the village and had almost no contact with the people outside, let alone the women outside. Of course, the middle-aged woman who had haggled with him for an hour didn't count. However, this feeling was real. Suddenly, a light flashed in Li Yi's mind and he suddenly thought of a possibility. Could it be that she knew the previous owner of this body? Looking at the woman's resentful expression, she looked very much like a resentful girl who had been abandoned. Could it be that the previous owner of this body slept with the girl and didn't pay? The more Li Yi thought about it, the more likely it was. He couldn't help but curse that bastard in his heart. He felt good about leaving such a mess to him. Now that the girl had bumped into him, what should he do? Li Yi was just an innocent virgin who had no experience in relationships in his 2 lifetimes. He really didn't know how to deal with this kind of thing. And at this time, the abnormality here had attracted the attention of many people in the hall. Isn't that Miss Zhuamo? She actually came today. Miss Zhuamo has always been on good terms with the Yunning Poetry Club. It's not strange for her to appear here. But who is that scholar? He seems to be acquainted with Miss Zhuamo. I saw him and Miss Wan talking for a while just now. He must be a scholar with some fame, but why does he look so unfamiliar? Because of the distance, the crowd didn't know what exactly happened here, but they were quite curious about the identity of the strange scholar. After all, Miss Zhuamo had always been arrogant and rarely saw her interact with men. But looking at the current situation, she seemed to have a close relationship with the strange scholar. Zhuamo, what's wrong? A gentle voice came from behind. Li Yi saw the beautiful woman called Miss Wan, and a few people from the Yuniying Poetry Club hurrying over, standing next to the woman who called him a lecher. When the women from the Yuniying Poetry Club saw Miss Suemo's expression, they looked at Li Yi suspiciously, and their eyes gradually became unfriendly. Miss Suemo? Only then did Li Yi know the woman's name. Sounded a little familiar. After thinking for a while, he finally remembered that the last time the little prince took him to the Jade Courtyard to listen to music, the woman who sang Immortal on the Magpie Bridge seemed to be called Zuemo or something. At that time, the little prince Li Xian praised the woman as rare in the world, but because she was wearing a veil, Li Yi didn't see her face clearly. Moreover, at that time his mind was filled with the excitement of hearing Immortal on the Magpie Bridge in this world. How could he have the time to see what she looked like? He thought that there were people in this world who had the same experience as him, but it turned out to be an empty joy. At that time, under the disappointment, he naturally wasn't in the mood to listen to music, and then left in disappointment. Now that he thought about it, he forgot to apologize to Miss Suemo. When he rushed up excitedly, he seemed to have grabbed her hand and scared her. No wonder she would think of him as a lecher. After the woman called out her name, Li Yi immediately understood the ins and outs of the matter. At this time his heart was relieved. Lecher was a lecher as long as he didn't sleep with the girl and didn't pay. Xiaohuan, let's go. He stretched out his hand and waved it in front of the little servant girl who didn't know what was going on, and took her hand and walked away. This matter was just a misunderstanding and it was his fault. When the two of them met again, Li Yi could just apologize and let bygones be bygones. However, since this woman was so aggressive, he naturally would not ask for a rebuff. Whether it was Miss Suemo or the top courtesan in the Jade Courtyard, what did it have to do with him? Anyway, the lives of the two people were destined not to have too much intersection. In this life, Li Yi only wanted to carry on the lucrative career of being the husband of the stronghold to the end. He wanted to guard the Willow Leaf Village and strive to earn enough money before the age of 20, then he could retire and start to enjoy his old age. If the days in the stronghold were boring, he could also go down the mountain to relax with Lu Rui and Xiao Huan behind his back. For example, he could go to the Jade Courtyard to listen to songs and so on. Of course, he would only ask for other people, not this Miss Suemo's business. The title of the top courtesan did not work on him. Chapter 67. You. Seeing the scholar holding the servant girl's hand and leaving with an indifferent expression, the anger on Zheng Zimo's pretty face became even stronger. However, seeing that many people had already noticed them, she still had some scruples in her heart. She snorted coldly and didn't chase after them. That night on the stage, this scholar rushed up and grabbed her hand as if he had gone crazy. She was really scared and subconsciously thought of him as a lecher. However, after thinking about it carefully, she felt that he didn't seem to want to take advantage of her. However, thinking about how he left without even saying a word of apology, she naturally felt a bit angry. For the past few days he had been thinking about this matter and always felt uncomfortable. When he saw that scholar who didn't understand etiquette again, all the accumulated anger was vented out. She originally thought that if he seriously explained and sincerely apologized, this matter could be resolved. However, who would have thought that he would ignore her like this, let alone have the slightest intention of apologizing? I'm so angry. She caressed her chest a few times and only then did she feel a little better. Drunken ink, what happened? Seeing her like this, the women all looked at each other. For some reason, Wan Ruoqing took a step forward and looked at her. We'll talk about this later. Sister Ruoqing, where's the osmanthus cake I asked you to bring for me? Zheng Zimo shook her head and suppressed the anger in her heart. She wanted to use a happy matter to divert attention. When she was unhappy, she would eat. This had always been her habit. Wan Ruoqing's expression froze and an awkward expression appeared on her pretty face. Seeing her expression, Zheng Zimo said with a bitter expression, "You can't have forgotten, right?" "Ahem, Zimo, you should tell us what happened just now," the older woman said with a dry cough. "It's just a lecher." "What's there to say?" Zheng Zimo glared fiercely at Li Yi's departing figure again. She gritted her teeth and deliberately emphasized the word, lecher. "Young master, what is a lecher?" On the other side, the servant girl scratched her head curiously and looked up at Li Yi. Just now that beautiful big sister said that the son-in-law was a lecher, and seemed to be very angry, but what was a lecher? Until now Xiao Huan had not figured it out. You're just a little girl. Don't ask. Li rubbed her head and said, Little girl, home? A puzzled expression appeared on the little servant girl's face again, but this time she roughly understood Li Yi's meaning. She lowered her head and rubbed the corner of her clothes, murmuring softly, Xiao Huan is already 15 years old, not young anymore. Son-in-law. She raised her head and was about to ask something when Li Yi picked up a piece of pastry from the table and stuffed it into her mouth. Try this. She made a few muffled sounds, but the servant girl knew that the son-in-law didn't seem to be willing to answer the question just now. After swallowing the pastry, she didn't speak anymore. What exactly did the lecher mean? Once he returned to the stronghold, he would ask his mistress and find out. That's right, that beautiful big sister just now, she seemed to have seen her somewhere before. The young girl sat there with one hand propping up her chin. She glanced in that direction from afar and just happened to see the side of Zheng Zimo's face. After a slight pause, she seemed to remember something. Her beautiful eyes suddenly widened and her small mouth also opened in surprise. At this moment, the figure of that beautiful big sister finally overlapped with a certain figure in the little servant girl's memory. That painting scroll that the son-in-law had her lock up in the cabinet, wasn't the woman drawn on it the beautiful big sister just now? For a moment, the little servant girl seemed to have discovered something incredible, and her heart immediately stirred. Previously, she had thought that the son-in-law probably liked the woman in the painting very much, which was why he had her carefully put it away and locked it in the cabinet. There were many things that the little servant girl didn't dare to ask. She could only think in her heart, just what kind of story did the son-in-law and that beautiful woman have? But every time she thought of this, there would be a sour feeling in her heart. Fortunately, apart from that hidden painting, the son-in-law was no different from before. After a long time, her heart gradually relaxed. And after seeing the woman in the painting today, the young girl's heart finally began to panic. Although she didn't understand what that beautiful big sister said, she and the son-in-law did indeed know each other. She was so angry. Was it because the young miss had snatched the son-in-law away? The little servant girl didn't want to think in the worst direction, but because of her worry, she couldn't help but guess. What if the son-in-law abandoned Xiao Huan and left with that beautiful big sister? If the son-in-law left, the young miss and second miss would definitely be very sad, but the one who would be the most sad would still be Xiao Huan. If the son-in-law was willing to bring Xiao Huan along? If that was the case, then Xiao Huan would definitely be overjoyed. No, Xiao Huan couldn't leave. If Xiao Huan also left, there would only be the two young misses left at home, and they would be even more sad. It would be best if the son-in-law didn't leave, and everyone could still be together like before. This was the best ending that the little servant girl could think of. No one knew when the poetry meet had officially begun. It should have been long prepared, and not long after, someone had already made a few poems. Upstairs and downstairs, there were people who gathered and evaluated each other. And at this moment, Li Yi heard a bad news from the gossip. Today's competition was limited to a few poetry meets. Even if someone made a good poem, it wasn't within the scope of the competition. At most, they would only receive a few words of praise from others. In other words, those few poetry meets were the absolute protagonists of today. Li Yi and the rest of the people here were just there to express their opinions on the poems that others brought out. Of course, to Li Yi, what he cared about was not the poem or the qualification to participate in the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet. If he didn't have the qualification to participate in the poetry written test, then even if he copied out a good poem, he would not have the chance to get the 100 silver taels. At this moment he was a little regretful. He should have checked the almanac before going out today. It must be written that it was forbidden to go out and it was better to stay at home. Not only did he embarrass himself in front of those girls, but it was also bad luck to run into that Lady Zuemo. Now even the last bit of comfort in his heart was gone. He had wanted to leave with Xiao Huan, but the fruits and pastries here were really quite delicious. It had taken a lot of effort to get here and it was not worth it to just leave like this. He should eat to his heart's content first. With this in mind, when he turned his head, he saw the little servant girl resting her chin with one hand. He didn't know what she was thinking, but the expression on her pretty face changed. Sometimes it was full of worry, and sometimes there was a smile at the corner of her mouth. There was even a moment when tears appeared at the corner of her eyes. Just as Li Yi was wondering what kind of drama was playing out in the little servant girl's heart, Zheng Zuemo's somewhat surprised voice sounded from the other side. What? My osmanthus cake was eaten by that lecher. After knowing what had just happened, Zheng Zuemo's eyebrows rose, and anger once again appeared on her pretty face. Her gaze was like a knife as she looked in a certain direction. Li Yi sensed something and looked up. When their gazes met in the air, sparks seemed to shoot out. At the same time they snorted coldly and turned their heads. Chapter 68. Actually, that scholar doesn't look like a lecher. I'm afraid there must be some misunderstanding. The slightly older woman from the Yunying Poetry Club said after a moment of silence. Zheng Zumo already understood that the scholar didn't do it on purpose, but his attitude of disregard just now still made her very angry. Although her impression of him as a lecher had changed, she still couldn't calm the anger in her heart. The woman named Wan Ruoqing saw the expression on Zheng Zumo's face and was slightly surprised. That scholar looked gentle, so how did he anger her to this extent? Thinking back to what just happened, she gradually had a guess. He came to ask for pastries from her because he thought she was a servant here. She couldn't help but look down at her clothes. Was she dressed like a servant today? Whether it was because of this or because of Zheng Zumo, she was more or less curious about the scholar. When she looked up in that direction, she just happened to see the scholar pick up a piece of preserved fruit. After a few breaths, he picked up a piece of pastry. After a few breaths, he drank a cup of tea and picked up another piece of preserved fruit. It seemed like he was more interested in these things than the poems made by the scholars. What a strange scholar. Seeing the scholar who was completely focused on the food in front of him, Ruoqing's cherry lips parted slightly and thought to herself. Not long after, someone else came up with a new composition which caused a round of applause. Several women got up from their seats and walked over to the other side. Li Yi sat there and would occasionally hear a few poems made by the so-called scholars around him. What followed was a round of praise from the crowd. Li Yi couldn't help but twitch the corner of his mouth when he heard those people praising those poems as if they were masterpieces that had been passed down from generation to generation. What good poems! These so-called excellent Mid-Autumn Festival poems were just a few people looking at the moon and feeling high. When it came to Mid-Autumn Festival poems, the ones that appeared in one's mind should be raise one's head to look at the bright moon, bow one's head to think of home, raise one's cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes 3, may people last forever 1,000 miles together. Compared to those poems that had been passed down for hundreds of generations, what was the one being praised now? The trace of disdainful mockery on Li Yi's lips was caught by Zheng Zumo, who had been staring at him from not far away. I wonder what kind of good poem he can make. He's quite arrogant. He snorted coldly. In his heart he had already regarded Li Yi as an arrogant student with no talent at all. Ouch. Xiao Huan's surprised voice rang in Li Yi's ears. He quickly turned his head and saw the little servant girl covering her head. A young man opposite her was covering his chest. The front of his shirt was wet. Sir, I'm sorry. The servant girl hurriedly lowered her head and apologized with a panicked expression. The young man clearly didn't have a good temper and was splashed with tea. He was about to scold her when he looked up to see that the person in front of him was such a pretty girl. His expression froze for a moment before an indescribable light flashed through his eyes. It's fine. The young man smiled and reached out to help her up. At this moment, a figure blocked in front of him. The young man frowned and asked, "Who are you?" "Son-in-law." Xiao Huan was like a child who had done something wrong and stood behind Li Yi. "Son-in-law?" The young man looked at Li Yi suspiciously and asked, "This lady, is this brother's servant girl?" "This servant girl is insensible and has caused trouble for brother." Li Yi cupped his hands and spoke apologetically. "It's just a small matter." The young man looked at the servant girl and a strange light appeared in his eyes. He then looked at Li Yi and asked with a smile, "Brother, you look very unfamiliar. Are you a scholar of Qing and Fu?" Li Yi noticed the way he looked at Xiao Huan. Seeing that he was clearly trying to get close to him, Li Yi furrowed his brows and casually said a few words. Just as he was about to lose his patience, the young man suddenly changed the topic. He pointed at the two girls standing behind him and said, "What do you think of my two servant girls?" Li Yi raised his head and glanced at him, not knowing what the other meant. These two girls were about 17 or 18 years old. They should be at the age of innocence, but their brows showed tiredness and their eyes were dim. They were far from Xiaohuan's liveliness. The young man smiled slightly and said, "To tell you the truth, I am quite interested in brother's servant girls. If brother is willing to part with them, I am willing to use these two servant girls in exchange." When the two girls standing behind the young man heard this, their expressions changed slightly. They raised their heads and glanced at Li Yi, and a glimmer of light appeared in their eyes. "Son-in-law." Hearing this, the servant girl's face paled. She immediately grabbed the corner of Li Yi's clothes tightly, afraid that Li Yi would trade her out. "My apologies, I have no interest in brother's servant girls." Li Yi raised his head to look at her and replied indifferently. "I'm being sincere. Why do you have to keep me at arm's length, brother? To tell you the truth, my father is the Anxi district magistrate. If brother has any problems in the future, I might be able to help." Seeing that Li Yi had no intention of agreeing, the young man was not in a hurry and continued to speak with a smile. Qing, an prefecture city, was under the jurisdiction of the Anxi district. Although there were many people in the prefecture city who could suppress the Anxi district magistrate in the eyes of most people, this title was enough to intimidate them. On the surface, the young man's words sounded like a negotiation, but in reality, it was a threat. What he secretly wanted to express was, "I like this girl. You have to change her no matter what. I am the son of the county magistrate. It's up to you to decide if you want to change her or not." However, while the title of the district magistrate's son could intimidate others, it could not intimidate Li Yi. He had slept in the prince's mansion and visited a brothel with the prince's son. What was a mere district magistrate's son to him? The young man didn't try to hide his words just now. Between scholars, exchanging maids and concubines was something that had happened since ancient times. To them it was a very normal thing. At this moment, many people had already gathered around, smiling and speaking up for the young man. "The one named Lu is not a good person. If that girl ends up in his hands, she will probably be defiled again. I wonder if that scholar, will he trade? The one named Lu's father is the district magistrate. I'm afraid that scholar." Sigh. Not far away, the women of the Union Poetry Society sighed. Their expressions were unsightly. After all, they were also women. Of course, they could not stand to see women being exchanged like goods. Wan Ruoqing also sighed. Although she was very angry about this, it was not something they could change. "This guy, he probably won't trade, right?" Although she hated Li Yi to the core, for some reason, Zheng Zimo had an indescribable confidence in him. "She is just a servant girl. If you are willing to part with her, I'm afraid it will become a good story in today's poetry meeting." At this time, a young man who seemed to be somewhat famous came up and looked at Li Yi with a smile. He said, "I am Su Wentin, the president of the Dongli Poetry Society. Brother Lu is my friend, so please give me some face." Li Yi gave him a bright smile and said, "Sell your mother." Puff. The next moment the scene became quiet. Zheng Zimo spat out the tea she had just taken. Chapter 69. Zheng Zimo hurriedly wiped away the water stains on her clothes. Deep shock surged onto her pretty face. At this moment she was somewhat suspicious. Had she heard incorrectly just now? In any case, the scholar was still a scholar. How could he say such unreasonable words? But when she turned her head, she saw that Wan Ruoqing and the other women had the same expression as her. They were clearly also shocked. Only then did she confirm that what the scholar had said just now was indeed those 4 words. Her mouth opened slightly. When she looked at the scholar standing in front of the young servant girl, her gaze changed for the first time. "This young master, how can he?" Wan Ruoqing's lips parted slightly. It was unknown what expression was on her pretty face. Scholars placed great importance on their manners. She had never seen a scholar say such vulgar words. She had always been disgusted by such things. But for some reason at this moment she couldn't feel any disgust towards the scholar. If the scholar really succumbed to the young man's despotic power, she would most likely be truly disappointed. She didn't think that not only did the scholar refuse, but the way he refused was so unique. The women who belonged to the Yunning Poetry Club beside her all had their lips curled up. They wanted to laugh but had to forcefully suppress it to avoid losing their composure. It was truly difficult. But at this moment when they looked at the scholar again, they instantly felt he was much more pleasing to the eye. "Sell your mother." Seeing the scholar in front of him say these words with a smile on his face, the young man named Zhou Xian's expression was first startled, then immediately turned red. He pointed a finger at Li Yi, his lips trembling, unable to say a word. He was a scholar and the people he usually interacted with were the same. As a famous scholar in Qing and Fu, there were great scholars in their conversations and there were no commoners. But which great scholar would open his mouth and say, "Sell your mother"? They were all scholars with status. Could they speak more civilly? Even though he was angry and wanted to curse back regardless of his status, he couldn't think of any curse words that could rival the 4 words just now. His face became even redder. It was really difficult for a scholar who had been reading the books of sages since he was young to compete with Li Yi, a veteran from the 21st century, in cursing. Vulgar man. Such filthy words. Unbearable. Unbearable. What a disgrace. You're a scholar in vain. Around Zhou Xian, the scholars who belonged to the Dongli Poetry Society were also stunned for a moment, but then their faces changed greatly, and they started to criticize Li Yi with livid faces. Everyone here is a scholar. Even if you don't agree, everyone will try to persuade you. Wouldn't it be fine as long as you agree? Why do you have to scold others? In the face of these people's accusations, Li Yi's expression did not change. After all, compared to the scolding methods in the future which often revolved around your mother, 18 generations of ancestors as the radius, genitals as the weapon and sexual fantasies as the skill, which radiated 360 degrees and overturned the entire family tree, curses such as disgraceful, unworthy of being a scholar, and even son of AB** did not have the slightest impact on him. Li Yi had restrained himself just now because he was worried that this kind of cursing skill would be too powerful. If he really angered some of them to death here, he would inevitably be sued. At the very least, he really didn't need to be angry with these guys. On the surface they were all geniuses and scholars, but secretly they were thieves and prostitutes. The things they did were dirtier than the previous one. Some of the dirty things could even be put on the table to be traded, but in their eyes, it was extremely normal. Especially when the scholar named Zhou Xian asked him to do him a favor with a smile, Li Yi felt that the 4 words he gave him couldn't be more suitable. It was simple and crude, but the effect was remarkable. The Dongli Poetry Club was the most popular candidate for the first place today, attracting the attention of many people. It didn't take long for the abnormality here to attract many people's attention. Many people in the surroundings looked over and several figures also walked down from the upstairs. Zhou Xian cherished his reputation after all. No matter what the result was, it wouldn't be a good thing for him. With a cold snort, he turned around and left without saying a word. Beside him, several people of the White Dew Poetry Club also glared at Li Yi with vicious eyes, showing disdain to associate with him. "I'll remember you." The young man who claimed to be the county magistrate's son glanced at Li Yi gloomily and said coldly. Behind him, 2 young girls' eyes flashed with a trace of sadness. They glanced at the little maid standing behind Li Yi with envy, then followed the young man and left silently. "Young master, it's all Xiaohuan's fault." After these people left one after another, the little maid pulled the corner of Li Yi's clothes and said while sobbing. There were tears at the corners of her eyes. "It's okay, it's not Xiaohuan's fault." Li Yi smiled and rubbed her head as he said softly. "But they all said that son-in-law." The young maidservant raised her head, 2 teardrops rolling down from her gem-like eyes. From what she heard, the words those people used to scold son-in-law were already very unpleasant to hear. "Oh," before she could finish her words, Li Yi stuffed a piece of pastry into her mouth. Li Yi pinched the little maid's pretty face. The little girl pouted and blinked innocently at him. He wiped her tears and said with a smile, "They are all bad people, they made our Xiaohuan cry. After eating this pastry, let's go home." That scholar's words just now were so satisfying. On the other side, a 16 or 17-year-old girl covered her mouth and laughed so hard that tears were about to flow down. Thinking of the expressions of Zhou Xian and the others when they just left, the women couldn't help but laugh. As women, they naturally couldn't bear to see men exchange maids and even concubines like goods. The scholar's actions won them a lot of good impressions. Zimo, I don't think that young master is a lecher at all. Otherwise he would have already exchanged the two girls. A woman looked at Zheng Zimo and said, do you have some misunderstanding with him? Even if he's not a lecher, he's not a good person either. Zheng Zimo pursed her lips and said disdainfully. No matter what, she couldn't forgive that guy's attitude towards her. As they were talking and laughing, a sudden cry came from upstairs. They all looked up and found that many people had gathered around a table. What happened over there? Could another masterpiece have appeared? While they were puzzled, the older woman went up the stairs. A moment later, she came down with a paper raft in her hand with a worried expression. Chapter 70. What happened up there? When the women came up to ask, the older woman had already handed over the paper raft. She sighed and said, this poem was written by Zhou Xian just now. Everyone take a look. A woman took the paper raft from his hand and in the next moment she began to recite. Although the others were all women, they were all known as talented women in Qing and prefectural city. After hearing a few lines, they could tell that the standard of the poem was far above that of ordinary people. What, is this poem well written? Zheng Zimo's knowledge of poetry was not deep. Unless it was something like Immortal of the Magpie Bridge, that ordinary people could distinguish, she had no ability to distinguish ordinary poems. Zhou Xian's Mid-Autumn Festival poem is indeed much better than Fang Zhou's, Wan Ruoqing said slowly with a complicated expression on her pretty face after the woman finished reciting. She could roughly judge the standard of the poem just by listening to it once. She had also heard the Mid-Autumn Festival poem written by Zhou Xian last year. She didn't expect it to go up another level this year. She was afraid that it would shine in the poetry meet tomorrow night. Sister Ruoqing, can your poem beat Zhou Xian's? Zheng Zimo looked at her and asked. She was very concerned about this. The Yunying Poetry Society's victory or defeat today would determine whether or not they had the right to participate in the true Mid-Autumn Festival tomorrow. If they won, she could enter with them and perhaps she could see that person then. I also didn't think that Zhou Xian would have such skill in Mid-Autumn Festival poem. I'm afraid I cannot compare. Wan Ruoqing shook her head and said with a wry smile. Based on this poem, Zhou Xian has already won today's competition. The older woman of the Yunying Poetry Society sighed and said. Although they didn't want to admit it, from ancient times until now in the path of poetry, women were always inferior to men. Hearing this, Zheng Zimo's pretty face showed disappointment. If the Yunying Poetry Society couldn't win, then they didn't have the right to participate in the Mid-Autumn Festival. Naturally, she wouldn't be able to see the talent called Li Yi. These days he could only keep the questions about that novel painting method in his mind. That person seemed to have appeared out of thin air and then disappeared. No matter how others searched, they couldn't find any information related to him. Zheng Zimo could only place all her hopes on tomorrow's poetry conference. With his talent, he shouldn't be absent from that kind of poetry conference. Knowing what she was thinking, Wan Ruoqing turned to look at her and said, even if we can attend the poetry competition tomorrow, we may not be able to see the person we want to see. Zheng Zimo understood everything that Wan Ruoqing had said, but this was still a ray of hope. If they lost today, even this hope would be gone. She turned her head in disappointment and saw that the scholar was holding a paper raft in his hand. After looking at it, the corners of his mouth curled up, and the expression she had seen before once again appeared on his face. This kind of expression was a little similar to the one she had when she saw the paintings of people who were not good at painting. Casually throwing the paper raft on the table, she said something to the young servant girl, and the two of them walked in the direction of the door. Gritting her teeth, she walked over to where the scholar had been, picked up the paper raft he had thrown away and moved her gaze to it. What was written on the paper raft was the poem that Zhou Xian had been praised by everyone. For a moment, the expression on Zheng Zimo's pretty face became very complicated, but it quickly turned into determination. She chased after the scholar's back. Zimo! Wan Ruoqing called her from behind. Seeing that she didn't seem to hear, a puzzled expression appeared on her pretty face. She put down Zhou Xian's poem and followed. Miss Zimo. On the way, she met a man who cupped his hands to her, but Zheng Zimo didn't pay attention to him. When she quickly walked past, the man's smile froze on his face. His gaze followed the direction of her back. The scholar and servant girl had already walked to the door. If he had known that this poetry conference didn't allow outsiders to participate, Li wouldn't have wasted so much time here. After tasting all the fruits and pastries inside, he planned to go back with Xiao Huan. Wait. When he reached the door, a voice suddenly came from behind. Li looked back and saw that the woman who had called him a lecher was walking over quickly. This woman, there's no end to it. Li frowned slightly, subconsciously thinking that this woman was here to cause trouble. Xiao Huan, let's go. As a man, he didn't want to fight with this crazy woman. Li took Xiao Huan's hand and was about to leave, but Zheng Zimo quickly ran a few steps and blocked in front of them. Xiao Huan looked at the beautiful woman in front of her, and a vigilant expression appeared on her face. She couldn't help but move closer to Li. What do you want now? Li looked at her and asked with a frown. He was obviously a little unhappy. As long as you do me a favor, we can write off all our previous grievances. Zheng Zimo looked straight into Li's eyes and said through gritted teeth. No. Li said lightly and took Xiao Huan's hand, intending to leave. He really didn't care about writing off all their grievances. Whether or not they would see each other again in the future was another matter. Why would he ask for trouble? Moreover, something that could make this woman put down her pride to ask for his help was probably not simple. He wasn't familiar with her, and strictly speaking, they had some minor grievances. Why should he help her? Stop. Zheng Zimo pointed at him, gritting her teeth so hard that they almost broke. Whether it was in the past or now, which man wasn't polite when they saw her? When had she ever been ignored like this? Why didn't this guy have the temperament of a scholar at all? But when she thought about how he could say those 4 words in front of so many people, she had no temperament to speak of. She had never been ignored like this. She only felt extremely wronged. Tears welled up in her eyes and she forced them not to fall. Sir, please wait. Li and Xiao Huan had already walked out the door and a soft voice came again from behind. His footsteps paused and he looked back at the gentle woman walking towards him. In the end, he didn't turn and leave like before. Just now he had asked for 2 pieces of cake from her, so of course he couldn't be too heartless in front of her. The woman named Wan Ruoqing walked over and first curtsied to Li, then said apologetically, Zumo is naughty and mischievous. If she has offended you in any way, Ruoqing is here to apologize to you. Please don't blame her. Li looked at this Miss Wan and then looked at Zheng Zimo, who was still staring at him with a pair of big eyes. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. They were both women, but why were their personalities so different? The little servant girl stood beside him and a bitter expression appeared on her pretty face. She already couldn't deal with a beautiful sister and now there was another one. Miss, where are you? Xiao Huan can't look after the son-in-law by herself. Chapter 71. Miss Wan is too polite. I didn't take this matter to heart. The voice of the woman in front of him was extremely gentle, giving off a feeling of a spring breeze. Li cupped his hands towards her and said with a smile. What do you mean you didn't take it to heart? I clearly took it to heart. Zheng Zimo watched as this scholar spoke coldly to her but smiled at elder sister Ruoqing. She felt extremely bitter and wanted nothing more than to pounce on him and bite him. It took her a great deal of effort to restrain this impulse. If you don't mind, you can call me Ruoqing. Wan Ruoqing looked up at him and said with a smile. Li glanced at Zheng Zimo again and gave her a meaningful look. You? Zheng Zimo's beautiful eyes were spitting fire. She almost couldn't suppress the impulse in her heart. Although Li didn't say it explicitly, she understood his eyes. The meaning was, look at how gentle, polite and likable she is. Then look at yourself. As a woman, don't you feel ashamed? Li nodded and said, if Miss Ruoqing doesn't have anything else, I will leave first. The beautiful woman seemed to hesitate for a moment before saying, to be honest, I do have something that I would like to ask for your help with. Li's expression froze. He clearly didn't expect Ruoqing to say something like this. His words just now were just a polite greeting. His intention to leave was already very obvious. A normal person would wave goodbye. Why didn't this Ruoqing follow the rules? Miss, please speak. Although Li was curious, he still smiled and said. He had a good impression of this Ruoqing. Li had imagined countless times how women in ancient times should look like. Virtuous and virtuous, suitable for home and home, refined and elegant. No matter what kind of imagination he had, of course, it didn't include smashing a solid wooden table with his bare hands, cutting off a tree trunk as thick as an arm, pointing at others like a shrew and calling them lechers. However, when he really came to this world, Li Yi found that reality was still very different from his imagination. Until he met Wan Ruoqing, the image of an ancient woman in his heart suddenly became clear. It was as if the woman had traveled through thousands of years and walked out of a painting. She smiled and curtsied to him, and a soft voice sounded. "Greetings, young master." In Li Yi's mind, this was the style that an ancient woman should have. For this reason alone, Li Yi would listen to what she had to say. Not to mention he had just eaten her food. If he refused before she finished, Li Yi was too embarrassed to do such a thing. Ruoqing knows that this is a bit presumptuous, but I wonder if young master could compose a mid-autumn festival poem for the Yunning Poetry Club? I would be very grateful. Wan Ruoqing looked up at him. Mid-autumn festival poem? Li Yi stilled. Wan Ruoqing's request was a bit unexpected. If she wanted someone to compose a poem, she should find the famous scholars in the Qing prefecture. He was just a nobody. Why did she have to find him? Zheng Zimo also paused slightly. Could it be that Sister Ruoqing also saw that this scholar was not ordinary? Wan Ruoqing nodded and then quietly waited for his answer. Just now, when everyone was appraising Su Wentian's poem, only this scholar was joking with the little servant girl. When Wan Ruoqing walked past him, she just happened to see him throw the paper with Su Wentian's poem to the side, discard it like an old shoe. She faintly heard him say in a low voice, raising a cup to invite the bright moon facing the shadow to form 3 people. Then he didn't say anything else. When these words entered her ears, an extremely clear image appeared in her mind. Drinking alone under the moon, facing only the bright moon and her own shadow. With just this sentence, the artistic conception had already spread out. Wan Ruoqing's attainments in poetry had already reached a higher level. Just from this incomplete poem, she could see that this scholar not only had a unique way of doing things, but in terms of poetic talent, Su Wentian's generation was far from his. However, with her personality, she would not take the initiative to ask for help. She lost. She could only blame herself for not having enough literary talent. Only when Zheng Zimo ran out and she heard her conversation with the scholar did she realize that Zheng Zimo had also seen through some things. After thinking about it, she still made this presumptuous request. After all, tomorrow's poetry meet was not only what Zheng Zimo was looking forward to. At the Chinese Valentine's Day poetry meet a month ago, she was the one who picked up the sky prayer lantern that fell from the sky. The poem, Immortal on the Magpie Bridge, that was written on it was also spread by her. Even now, many people still thought that the poem was written by her. In these days, in the eyes of everyone, there had been an inextricable connection between her and the Immortal of the Magpie Bridge. However, Wan Ruoqing knew that she would not be able to compose such a poem in her lifetime. She had the same reverence and admiration towards the scholar named Li Yi as many women. If she could meet him once, she could fulfill one of her life's wishes. "Miss, are you here to participate in tomorrow's mid-autumn poetry meet?" Li Yi looked at her and asked in confusion. Wan Ruoqing smiled and said, "To be honest, the reason the Yunning Poetry Club wants to win today's competition is because there is someone we want to meet at tomorrow's mid-autumn poetry meet." Seeing Ruoqing's beautiful face reveal the adoration of a fan towards her idol, Li Yi was extremely surprised. Could it be that Wan Ruoqing, Zheng Zimo, and the other women of the Yunning Poetry Club were all going to the meet to meet a certain famous scholar? Thinking of this possibility, Li Yi suddenly felt a strong sense of envy towards that unknown fellow. There was no need to mention Wan Ruoqing. She was so beautiful, had a good personality, and seemed to be very talented in literature. As for that Zheng Zimo, although her personality was terrible, her looks and figure did not lose to Wan Ruoqing at all. Then there were the women of the Yunning Poetry Club. Scholars were so popular these days. Even these talented women were charmed. Who knew how many more ignorant girls were fans of that fellow? Li Yi always thought that the career of being the husband of a stronghold was very promising. There were beautiful sisters at home, and when he had nothing to do he could bring beautiful servant girls everywhere. But now, compared to that person, Li Yi suddenly felt that the difference was like heaven and earth. Sigh, the heavens are blind. Doesn't he just know a few lousy poems? What's so great about it? Even a woman like Wan Ruoqing can't help but like him. Li Yi sighed in his heart, and his face showed an extremely regretful expression. In the eyes of Zheng Zimo and Wan Ruoqing, this was naturally a sign of rejection. Forget it, Sister Ruoqing, let's go. I don't want to beg this lecher. Zheng Zimo raised her eyebrows and glared fiercely at Li Yi. She didn't want to be bullied by him anymore, so she pulled Wan Ruoqing's hand and was about to leave. Wan Ruoqing's pretty face also showed a look of disappointment, but she was not surprised. They didn't know each other, so it was indeed a bit too much for her to make such a request. It was also when she and Zheng Zimo were about to leave that the scholar's voice finally came over. Since tomorrow's poetry conference is of great significance to Lady Ruoqing, how can I refuse? Chapter 72. A gentleman helps others achieve their goals. Zheng Zimo turned to look at Li Yi. No matter how she thought about it, she couldn't associate the word gentleman with the scholar in front of her. After all, no gentleman would say your mother every time he opened his mouth. But no matter what, he finally agreed. However, when she thought about how he rejected her without even thinking when she asked him for help, and how he agreed so easily when it was Sister Ruoqing, she couldn't help but feel an inexplicable sourness in her heart. She looked at Li Yi with resentment. Thank you, young master. Seeing that Li Yi agreed, Ruoqing's pretty face showed a joyful expression. Don't rush, I have another condition. Li Yi spoke again. What condition? Zheng Zimo looked at him and her eyes suddenly became vigilant. Although she came from a brothel, she was a pure person who only sold her skills and not her body. If Li Yi made any excessive demands, she wouldn't agree even if she didn't ask him to compose a poem. Li Yi glanced at Zheng Zimo, who was obviously thinking too highly of herself and didn't pay attention to her. He turned to look at Ruoqing and asked, Miss Ruoqing only wants to win today's competition so that she can participate in the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet, right? Wan Ruoqing nodded but didn't understand what Li Yi meant. At this time, Li Yi looked at her and said, I heard that the winner of today's poetry club will receive 100 taels of silver as a reward. I don't want anything else, just this 100 taels of silver. Helping was helping, but he still had to ask for the benefits he deserved. The girls from the Yunying Poetry Club and Wan Ruoqing wanted the right to participate in the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet. Li Yi wanted the 100 taels of silver. Everyone took what they needed. This was a win-win situation. Wan Ruoqing was startled when she heard this. She looked up at Li Yi and nodded. That's how it should be. Even though 100 taels of silver was not a small amount to them, they didn't care about that. That was just a bonus for winning the competition. If they lost the competition, they wouldn't even have the right to participate in the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet, not to mention the 100 taels of silver. She didn't need to ask for the opinions of those women and could help them make the decision. A miser. All you think about is money. Zheng Zimo cursed in her mind. Her disdain for Li Yi was obvious. Now that the conditions were settled, the three of them turned around and walked back into the hall. Along the way, Wan Ruoqing walked beside Li Yi and said something to him. Slightly behind them, Zheng Zimo raised her head and glared at Li Yi from time to time. If her gaze was a knife, Li Yi would have been cut into pieces by now. The servant girl followed behind them. She looked at Li Yi for a while and then secretly peeked at Wan Ruoqing and Zheng Zimo. She was still a bit uneasy. Upstairs, several people looked down. After a moment of shock, they spoke with some confusion. Who's that man with Lady Wan and Lady Zimo? He looks unfamiliar. Probably a friend of Lady Wan. I saw him with the people from the Yunying Poetry Club. It's him. Why would Lady Wan make friends with such a vulgar person? Among these people there were those who didn't know Li Yi. At this moment, they were shocked that Wan Ruoqing and Zheng Zimo were so close to a man. Some had just seen him scold Su Wentian away. They were even more shocked. How did this person get together with Wan Ruoqing, the famous talented girl of Qing'an Prefecture, and Zheng Zimo, the top artist of the Jade's Yard? They didn't even have the mood to make friends with such a vulgar person and a refined scum. Could it be that those two girls just happened to like this kind of style? At this time, the women of the Yunying Poetry Club were gathered in a corner. The poems on the table in front of them were the ones that everyone had already read. Even though they were unwilling, they had to admit that in terms of poetry, they were far inferior to those men. Could it be that we are destined to have no fate with the mid-autumn poetry meet? A girl said unwillingly. All the girls sighed and remained silent. At this time Wan Ruoqing and Li Yi walked over. I'll leave everything to you, young master. Wan Ruoqing bowed to Li Yi and said with a serious expression. Ruoqing, this is... Seeing the scholar again, confusion appeared on the women's faces. When the older woman came forward to ask, Li Yi had already picked up a brush. He dipped it in ink and was about to write when he seemed to remember something. He turned back to look at Ruoqing and handed the brush to her. He said, let me read. Miss Ruoqing, you write. Wan Ruoqing naturally didn't know that Li Yi was afraid that her words were too ugly and would be laughed at. She thought that this young master was very thoughtful. Since this was a work that represented the Yunying Poetry Club, she naturally had to write it herself. She took the brush from Li Yi's hand. Under the slightly confused gazes of the women, Li Yi had already begun to speak. A pot of wine among the flowers, drinking alone with no companionship. It's a poem. The women exclaimed softly. Their eyes were full of surprise, but they still didn't understand what was going on. Can this guy really do it? Zheng Zimo looked at him, still uncertain. After all, she was only guessing just now. If this scholar was just an arrogant student without any talent, then wouldn't everything she had done just now be in vain? Raising a cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes 3. It was also at this time that the second line of Li Yi's poem was recited. In an instant, the expressions of the rather talented women froze. In the next moment their expressions changed. Seeing that their expressions had all become very solemn, Zheng Zimo was startled. Then she looked at Li Yi and a thought of disbelief rose in her heart. Could it be that his poems are really that powerful? Since the moon cannot be drunk, the shadow follows me. Temporarily accompanying the shadow of the moon, joy must last until spring. Li Yi's voice continued. Beside him, Ruoqing picked up the brush and began to write. Neat and beautiful lines of hairpin-style small regular script appeared on the paper. My song lingers in the moon, my dancing shadow is messy. When awake we are joyful, when drunk we are separated. Forever unrequited we meet again in the clouds. When Ruoqing finished the last word, Li Yi spoke again. This poem is called, Drinking Alone Under the Moon. Zheng Zimo stood to the side in a daze. She saw that the gazes of the people around her seemed to be attracted by the poem on the paper and didn't move away for a long time. When she turned to look at the calm scholar again, her expression began to change. After a while, the women from the Yunying Poetry Club finally moved away from the paper. They looked at each other and an indescribable light appeared on their faces. Congratulations, Brother Su. Brother Su has great literary talent. We admire you. With Brother Su's poem, you will definitely shine at the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet tomorrow. I will congratulate Brother Su in advance. You flatter me, you flatter me. Somewhere upstairs, Su Wenyin was accepting the crowd's compliments. He kept saluting back, already forgetting the unhappiness that had just happened. His entire person felt like he was floating. Since the Qishi Poetry Meet a month ago, he had been completely suppressed by the White Dew Poetry Club. Only now did he finally turn the tables and return to the peak of his life. Brother Su's poem is truly breathtaking. Tomorrow, I'm afraid you'll be able to compete with Yang Yanzhou and Xin Zhaoji to see who's better. Opposite Su Wenyin, a scholarly robed young man laughed. Brother Su exaggerates too much. I still have some self-awareness. There are many scholars in Qingyun Prefecture. Even those who are proficient in poetry would not dare to say they can beat these two. Hearing this, Su Wenyin shook his head and said. The young scholar smiled and was about to speak when a paper raft came from the side. His eyes inadvertently swept over. His gaze could not move away. Chapter 73. Brother Su, Brother Su. Su Wenyin looked at the young man who had suddenly fallen into a daze. After calling him twice, the other still didn't come back to his senses. He couldn't help but feel very puzzled. Moving forward in time a little earlier. A pot of wine among the flowers, drinking alone with no companionship. Raising a cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes 3 people. Since the moon cannot be drunk, the shadow follows me. Temporarily accompanying the shadow of the moon, joy must last until spring. Forever unfeeling and traveling, we will meet in the clouds. Ruoqing this poem. As Ruoqing wrote, drinking alone under the moon, on the Xian paper with graceful handwriting, the expressions of the talented women of the Yunying Poetry Club gradually changed from puzzlement to shock. After she stopped writing, the older woman turned to look at her and opened her mouth in disbelief. How does this poem compare to what Fang Wentian did? Zheng Zimo had seen the change in the expressions of the women just now. She couldn't help but ask impatiently. Hearing this, the older woman's expression became solemn. She said, "How can the light of a grain of rice compete with the brilliance of the moon? What virtue and ability does Fang Wentian have to compare with this legendary poem?" Legendary poem. Zheng Zimo's cherry lips parted slightly. It was as if a bolt of lightning had flashed through her mind. That unreasonable guy's poetic talent was actually at such a high level? If this poem were to spread, I'm afraid that all the scholars of our Jing kingdom, no matter when or where, as long as they raise a cup to drink, they will inevitably recite, raising a cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes three people. A young woman's beautiful eyes became dazed as she murmured. The performance of the talented women was not out of Li Yi's expectations. One had to know that this drinking alone under the moon, even among all of Li Bai's works, was considered the best of the best. Raising a cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes three people, was a line that had been passed down for thousands of years. Who was Li Bai? He was an existence that stood at the peak of the ancient literary world. Any random poem he threw out was enough to scare people to death. Wan Ruoqing's pretty face was also filled with uncontrollable excitement. When she heard the poem, she only guessed that this young master should have some talent, but she never thought that his talent would be so high. Putting aside her personal feelings, the standard of this poem was already comparable to the Immortal Magpie Bridge. Of course, in Wan Ruoqing's heart, she still preferred Immortal Magpie Bridge. Putting aside the relationship between her and that poem in the Jing Kingdom for various reasons, the development of poetry was more prosperous than that of poetry and was more popular. As for poetry, it was indeed very popular during the previous dynasty. However, for the past 100 years, the literati of the Jing Kingdom still preferred writing lyrics. Because of this, although Drinking Alone Under the Moon had a very high standard, but in terms of influence, it would not surpass Immortal Magpie Bridge. However, if this poem was compared to something like Fang Wentian, it would be making a mountain out of a molehill. When the shock in their hearts subsided a little, everyone's gazes couldn't help but look at Li Yi. For them, through a poem, they could see the character of the poet and even what he was thinking when he wrote the poem. Drinking alone under the moonlight with no one close to him, from lonely to not lonely, then from not lonely to lonely. His poetry was broad-minded and there was no room between himself and the world. What kind of breadth of mind was this? Raising a cup to invite the bright moon, facing the shadow of three people. What kind of desolation would come after this kind of self-satisfaction? The scholar's expression was calm, but the hearts of the talented women were already filled with a myriad of emotions. Being stared at by so many women, Li Yi truly felt a little guilty. He coughed lightly and the pretty faces of the women blushed slightly. Only then did they realize that as women, staring at a man like this was a very unreasonable action. He hurriedly returned to his seat and copied the poem from just now onto a few pieces of paper, passing it around among the crowd. Not far from Li Yi, Zheng Zimo sat there. She didn't know whether to be happy or angry at this moment. She was happy because there was hope of winning today's competition and participating in tomorrow's mid-autumn poetry meet. She was angry because the heavens were blind and gave that unreasonable person such a good talent. As for the servant girl standing next to Li Yi, although her head was still dizzy, she was very happy inside. It seemed that the son-in-law's poem had scared these sisters. Last Qixi, son-in-law had even written a poem on Xiao Huan's prayer lantern. It was called something something Immortal. At last month's Qixi poetry meet, Fang Zhou suppressed Su Wentian. If not for the Immortal Magpie Bridge that appeared out of nowhere, I'm afraid he would have been the champion that day. But today he was overshadowed by Su Wentian. If the White Dew Poetry Club doesn't have a better poem, I'm afraid they will lose this time. That's not surprising. In the field of poetry, it has always been difficult to distinguish who is better. Fang Zhou is good at Qixi poems, and Su Wentian's poem about the moon is very outstanding. It is very suitable for this mid-autumn poetry meet. It is no surprise that Fang Zhou lost to him. Speaking of which, the talented women of the Yunning Poetry Club can't be underestimated. I wonder if they have any good poems tonight? Of course they do. Lady Wan's poem about the moon is above Fang Zhou's, but it is still inferior to Fang Wentian's. Somewhere on the first floor, a few scholars raised their cups and drank, judging the outstanding works of today's poetry meet. In the end, they are just women. In that case, the winner today is definitely the Dongli Poetry Club. With this poem, I'm afraid Su Wentian won't be unknown at tomorrow's meet. A man in green said with a sigh. He took a paper raft from a passing servant and wanted to see which poetry club had new works. That's not necessarily true. After all, there are many scholars in Qing Prefecture tomorrow. There will be no lack of good works. Whether Su Wentian can make the list depends on his luck. As they talked, they didn't realize that one of them was silent for a long time. A shocked expression gradually appeared on his face. I hope Su Wentian can make a name for himself tomorrow. This way we can boast about him in the future and share his glory. A scholar said with a smile. Before he finished his second sentence, a voice suddenly came from beside him. Everyone wait. This voice was slightly louder, and the scholar swallowed the words he was about to say. The few of them looked at him with puzzled expressions. The scholar in green still had a shocked expression as he slowly handed over the paper raft in his hand. After the few people took it, they moved their heads closer. After a few breaths, their expressions all changed. Back to the upper floor. Brother Su? Brother Su? Su Wentian didn't know how many times he called until he reached out and shook his shoulder. Only then did the young man wake up. Brother Su, what has happened to make Brother Su so absent-minded? When he looked up, he saw Su Wentian looking at him with puzzlement. A complicated expression appeared on the young man's face. He looked at Su Wentian and handed over the paper raft in his hand. Brother Su, take a look. Chapter 74. Su Wentian accepted the paper raft he handed over. Seeing the expression on his face, he suddenly had a bad feeling. His gaze swept over the paper raft. Not long after, a hint of surprise appeared on Su Wentian's face. Then it darkened. Who wrote this poem? He turned his head to look at the man named Su. There was no longer any trace of joy on his face. The handwriting is hairpin-style small regular script. It must have been written by one of the talented women from the Yunning Poetry Society. This poem was probably written by them. The man named Su pointed to the handwriting on the raft. He reached out and patted Su Wentian's shoulder. He sighed and said, Brother Su, you don't have much time left. Su Wentian knew what he meant. If he couldn't create a poem that surpassed the standard of this poem in a short amount of time, they would lose today's competition without a doubt. They would also lose the right to attend the poetry competition tomorrow. However, the words of the youth surnamed Su still made him want to curse out loud. What did he mean by he didn't have much time left? Even if he was given another day, a month, a year, or even a lifetime, he still might not be able to create such a poem. If he had this kind of ability, how could the title of the foremost scholar of Qing and Fu fall onto the heads of Yang Yanzhou and Xinzhao? Raising a cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes 3. This line of the poem was like an insurmountable mountain lying in front of Su Wentian, making him feel a strong sense of powerlessness just by looking at it. Unsurpassable. Impossible, this is impossible. No one in the Yunning poetry competition could create a poem like this, not even that Ruoqing Wan. Su Wentian's expression was ugly as he said, this poem doesn't seem to be written by a woman at all. A pot of wine among the flowers, drinking alone with no friends, no family, no friends. Just this point alone is enough to satisfy them. Furthermore, forever marrying without love, meeting in the clouds. How can a woman have such breadth of mind? Su Wentian was very talented. After reading the poem a few times, he had an idea. He said, let's go take a look. I don't believe this poem was written by the Yunning Poetry Society. The youth surnamed Su also had the intention to go downstairs, so he nodded and followed behind him. At this moment, the location of the Yunning Poetry Club downstairs was already abnormally crowded. Not long after the poem spread, people started to walk over. Their expressions were complicated, but there was also a hint of admiration. There were so many scholars here, but they couldn't even compare to a few women. This inevitably made the men lose face, but that poem was really well written. At this time no one mentioned Zhou Xian's name. The excellent mid-autumn poem he had just composed was also forgotten by everyone. The exuberance of young Mrs. Talent truly causes all of us to feel ashamed and resentful. After today, I'm afraid the title of the most talented woman in Qing and Prefecture will belong to Miss Wan. She's not just the most talented woman. If this poem were to be presented at tomorrow's poetry competition, I guarantee that even Yang Yanzhou and Xin Zhao would have to concede defeat. We are fortunate enough to be able to witness such a legendary poem. We have no regrets. All the girls heard were words of praise, far more than what Fang Wentin had just said. There were even people who compared the top 2 scholars in Qing'an Prefecture to her, and came to the conclusion that they were far inferior. All of this was because the standard of this drinking alone under the moon was truly high to the heavens. The talented women of the Yuning Poetry Club were surrounded by the crowd. Their faces were full of excitement. Naturally, there were also many people surrounding Wan Ruoqing. Hearing their praises, her face was slightly embarrassed. She glanced at Li Yi guiltily. Seeing him smiling at her, her face became even redder. That poem, it was clearly written by the son-in-law. The little servant girl at the side pouted and muttered in a small voice. In her heart she was angry for the son-in-law. When Su Wentian and the youth surnamed Su came downstairs, they were blocked outside the crowd and couldn't squeeze in. Everyone make way, don't push. Who stepped on my foot? Damn it, which shameless scoundrel touched my butt? The two of them squeezed in with great difficulty and instantly attracted the dissatisfaction of the crowd. When they turned their heads and saw that the person who came was Su Wentian, their expressions became strange and they made way for him. After all, if it wasn't for the sudden appearance of a super dark horse, the person who had the last laugh today would have been Su Wentian. Gaining and losing, the taste in his heart was probably not good at all. Everyone also wanted to see his reaction. It would be best if he would give a speech about not receiving the award. Under the gaze of the crowd, Su Wentian walked next to the women of the Yuning Poetry Club. He first raised his hands in greeting and said, "This, drinking alone under the moon, is the peak of Mid-Autumn Festival poetry. I, Su, am full of admiration." At this point the topic suddenly changed. I wonder which talented woman of the Yuning Poetry Club wrote this poem. Among the women, the face of the younger girl changed slightly. Even though it quickly returned to normal, Su Wentian still caught it. The corners of his mouth curled into a smile. There was indeed something fishy about this. "Is it Lady Wan?" Su Wentian looked at Wan Ruoqing with a smile that was not a smile. "No." Wan Ruoqing shook her head. No matter how much she wanted to win today's competition, she couldn't say such untruthful words. Could it be Lady Zumo? Su Wentian turned to look at Zheng Zumo and asked, "I don't have such literary talent." Zheng Zumo shook her head and said, "Then, there's no need to ask. This poem was written by this young man." It was obvious that Su Wentian was deliberately trying to embarrass them. Before he could finish, Wan Ruoqing pointed at Li Yi beside her and said. Li Yi looked at Wan Ruoqing helplessly and couldn't help but sigh in his heart. This young lady is really honest. As soon as Wan Ruoqing's voice fell, there was an immediate uproar. What? This poem wasn't written by Lady Wan. That scholar can actually produce such a masterpiece. If that's the case, this poem can't be counted as written by the Yuning Poetry Society. What a pity. If this wasn't the case, this poem would have won the competition tomorrow. Seeing the astonished expressions on everyone's faces, Fang Wentian revealed a smile. He looked at Wan Ruoqing and said, "If I remember correctly, other than the poetry clubs, outsiders are not allowed to participate in this competition, right?" The faces of the few women from the Yuning Poetry Society changed slightly. There was indeed such a rule in today's competition. However, every poetry society would invite a few scholars that they were familiar with. If they could compose a good poem, it would count as a poem from their own society. This was something that everyone had a tacit understanding about. However, rules were rules. If they were serious, poems written by outsiders naturally did not count. Thinking of this, their hearts all sank. What if this young man isn't an outsider? At this moment, a voice suddenly came from the side. Chapter 75. The leader of the Yunying Poetry Society, the slightly older woman, walked over. She looked at Su Wentian and said, "What if this gentleman is not an outsider?" "What do you mean, Miss Zhao?" Su Wentian asked with a frown. "To be honest, this gentleman has long joined the Yunying Poetry Society. His poems can naturally represent us," Zhao Yunru said slowly as she looked around at the crowd. When these words were spoken, the women of the Yunying Poetry Society, including Wan Ruoqing and Xing Zimo, all froze. This gentleman, when did he join the Yunying Poetry Society? He also stilled. When did he join the Yunying Poetry Society? How come he didn't know? At this moment, Li Yi saw the woman winking at him discreetly, and he immediately understood what was going on. Yes, from now on he was a member of the Yunying Poetry Society. At the same time, an uproar immediately came from the surrounding crowd. How is this possible? He's a man. The Yunying Poetry Society has always only been women. When has a man ever joined? Clearly, Zhao Yunru's words just now had a great impact on them. The Yunying Poetry Society was formed by the talented women of Qing and Prefecture and had never accepted any men. Where did this person come from? The Yunying Poetry Society has always only been women. This is something everyone knows. Miss Zhao, please do not joke. Su Wentian still had a faint smile on his face. Zhao Yunru's words were clearly just a temporary measure. However, she used the wrong method and could not be exposed. Hearing this, Zhao Yunru looked at the crowd with a slight smile and said, "When did we say that the Yunying Poetry Society only allowed women to join?" The smile on Su Wentian's face froze. The surrounding hubbub also gradually quieted. A sliver of shock floated onto everyone's faces and they revealed thoughtful expressions. Very quickly they realized that from beginning to end, the Yunying Poetry Society seemed to have never said such a thing. It was only because of the name of the Yunying Poetry Society and the fact that the members were all women that they naturally had their previous thoughts. However, the leader of the Poetry Society had personally refuted the rumors and denied that only women could join the Yunying Poetry Society. What else could they say? No wonder when this scholar came in he was so familiar with Lady Wan and the women of Yunying Poetry Club. It turns out that he is also a member of Yunying Poetry Club. The Yunying Poetry Club actually allows men to join. Turns out that we have been mistaken all along. This way, this poem can naturally represent the Yunying Poetry Society. If they can participate in tomorrow's Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet, with this person there, Yang Yanzhou and Xin Zhao will have to die on the spot. I'm afraid the title of the #1 scholar in Qing'an Prefecture is about to change hands. That's not necessarily the case. Although this poem is good, every time Xin Zhao writes a poem, it will be widely circulated in the brothels and music halls. No matter how good the poem is, it can't be compared to it. Just now, everyone had only thought that Zhao Yunru's words were a ploy. However, when they thought of how the scholar had headed straight for the Yunying Poetry Society when he came in and behaved intimately with Wan Ruoqing and the others, they thought that they already knew each other. There was no longer any doubt in their hearts. The two scholars who had followed Li Yi in stood at the back of the crowd and stared dazedly at him. They murmured, "So that brother really does know Lady Wan. He is also a member of the Yunying Poetry Society. Hid it so well from us." Su Wentian's expression was dark. He had not thought that one sentence from Zhao Yunru would turn his attack into nothing. That scholarly scum was actually a member of the Yunying Poetry Society. This was far beyond his expectations. However, he was not willing to give up just like this. Tomorrow's Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet would be his time to shine and amaze the world with a single brilliant feat. He would not allow anyone to ruin it. Raising his head to look at Zhao Yunru, he gritted his teeth and said, "Even so, this poem does not count because today's competition is competing in Mid-Autumn Poetry Festival, not Mid-Autumn Poetry Festival." Hearing Su Wentian's words, Zhao Yunru was first slightly startled. Then she said with slight anger, "What's the difference between poetry and poetry? Even the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet has always been about poetry. Hearing this, Zhou Xian said lightly, but today we are competing in Mid-Autumn Poetry Festival. Lady Zhao cannot deny this, right? Zhao Yunru was momentarily speechless. She could not find a reason to refute. At that time, when the few poetry societies set the rules, they did not consider this kind of situation. This was because talents who were good at writing poems were very rare. At the poetry gathering, poems usually took up more than 90% of the time. Even if there were poems, they were all mediocre. Therefore, there was no difference whether they competed for Mid-Autumn Festival poems or Mid-Autumn Festival poems. In the end, one of the poems would be the winner. She had never thought that Zhou Xian would take advantage of this loophole. This way, this Mid-Autumn Poetry Festival that would be passed down through the ages would not count today. After Zhou Xian finished speaking, all of the surrounding candidates frowned. This Zhou Xian is too narrow-minded. Even if this person has some talent, he will not be able to become a great person. I never thought that Zhou Xian would be this kind of person. That day when the rules were set, they actually neglected this point. Otherwise, this situation would not have happened. Even though Zhou Xian is somewhat shameless, but this time he is really standing on the side of reason. What a pity. If this piece of work won in the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet, we would also be honored. What a pity. After today, Zhou Xian's image in the eyes of many scholars would definitely plummet. However, at this moment he could not care less. If he could make a name for himself in the poetry meet tomorrow, then he would gain much more than he would lose. So, this means that the winner today will definitely be Brother Zhou? The youth with the surname Lu, who had just clashed with Li Yi, laughed and looked at Li Yi and the other women from the Yuning Poetry Society. Zhao Yunru and the other women from the Yuning Poetry Society were filled with anger, but they could not speak. Zheng Zimo was somewhat anxious. Her heart was filled with great disappointment after the initial surprise. Did he still fail in the end? Young master, this is all Ruoqing's fault. I did not explain this to you beforehand. Wan Ruoqing looked at Li Yi apologetically. Her eyes were slightly red as she spoke softly. If she had thought of this earlier, the current situation wouldn't have happened. Yuning Poetry Society, what a pity. There is no need to be too pessimistic. After today, just this poem alone will be enough for that scholar to become famous in the entire Qing'an prefecture. The Yuning Poetry Society will also be known by everyone. Zhou Xian has lost the support of the people. Although he won, he lost. Although the Yuning Poetry Society lost, it was still glorious. The rules could not be changed. Although the scholars present did not like Zhou Xian's actions, they could only sigh at the Yuning Poetry Society. Putting aside this poem, Zhou Xian's Mid-Autumn Festival poem truly surpassed everyone else's. I'm afraid I have to congratulate Brother Zhou in advance. The youth with the surname Lu smiled and saluted Zhou Xian. Brother Lu, it's too early to say that. Zhou Xian clasped his hands together and said humbly. Li Yi let out a long sigh as he watched the two of them hypocritically echoing each other. Young master. Wan Ruoqing looked up at him apologetically. Just as she was about to speak, Li Yi waved his hand. He looked at her and said somewhat reproachfully, "You should have said earlier if you wanted a poem or not." Chapter 76. At first, Wan Ruoqing had said that she wanted to compose a Mid-Autumn Festival poem, but the only one Li Yi could recite was Su Shi's Shuidiao Getu. However, Shuidiao Getu had stood at the pinnacle of Mid-Autumn Festival poems for thousands of years. Once this poem came out, all other poems were useless. The standard was so high that it could scare people to death. In this small competition, Li Yi really could not bear to take it out. After all, that kind of poem, if he took it out, there would be one less poem. Just for 100 silver, it was really not worth it. When he came in, he talked with Wan Ruoqing and found out that both Mid-Autumn Festival poems and Mid-Autumn Festival poems could be used. The first thing he thought of was Li Bai's Drinking Alone Under the Moon. This was also one of the few poems that Li Yi could recite without cheating. The other one was Raising My Head to Look at the Moon, Lowering My Head to Think of My Hometown. Although there were only 4 lines in Quiet Night Thoughts, it became Li Bai's most influential work. Every child who started to learn ancient poetry, the first line they had to recite was, "The moonlight in front of my bed, I suspect it to be the frost on the ground. Thus, in Li Yi's heart, this poem was far more important than drinking alone under the moon. He was not willing to take it out. He did not think that this stupid poetry competition would only allow people to compose lyrics and not poems. If that was the case, it would be better to just call it a poetry competition. What a waste of people's time. You should have said so earlier. Wan Ruoqing raised her head and looked at him. Suddenly, some hope rose in her heart. Young master, what do you mean? Li Yi actually did not have any other intentions. The earlier he finished here, the earlier he could go home for dinner. I'll have to trouble Miss Ruoqing to write again. Li Yi looked at her and smiled. At this time, Ruoqing finally understood the meaning of Li Yi's words. He actually wants to compose another Mid-Autumn Festival poem on the spot. For poetry gatherings like the Double Seventh Festival or the Mid-Autumn Festival, the theme was unusually clear. The poetry gatherings were limited to the Double Seventh Festival and Mid-Autumn Festival poems. The scholars who participated in the poetry gatherings usually started preparing long before the event. They even spent months to polish their poems and refine every word. Only then would they be able to produce the stunning moment of the poetry gatherings. If they were asked to compose lyrics on the spot, even the so-called foremost scholar of Qingyan Prefecture would most likely only be able to come up with a mediocre piece. After drinking alone under the moon was rejected, it was practically impossible for them to come up with another Mid-Autumn Festival poem that could surpass Su Wentian's in a short period of time. They didn't have any hope at all. Miss Ruoqing. Li Yi saw that Wan Ruoqing did not move, so he waved his hand in front of her eyes. After Wan Ruoqing came back to her senses, she glanced at Li Yi again and hurriedly picked up the brush. She spread out another piece of rice paper and stood quietly by the side, waiting for Li Yi to speak. Although she didn't know why this young master didn't write on his own this time, she was only puzzled for a moment before she immediately listened to his arrangements. Her action naturally aroused the curiosity of the crowd. What is Miss Wan doing? Is she going to write another Mid-Autumn Festival poem? Even if she really did it, it's impossible for her to surpass Su Wentian. Many of the candidates sighed in their hearts. No one thought highly of Wan Ruoqing. After all, even the Mid-Autumn Festival speech that Su Wentian had meticulously prepared was suppressed by him. How could he possibly beat the other party with his improvisation? When Su Wentian saw this, a mocking expression appeared on his face. If Ruoqing's meticulous preparation for the past few months was enough to threaten him, the lyrics she wrote on the spot probably wouldn't be as good as the one she just wrote. Ruoqing. The women of the Yuniying Poetry Society also guessed the same. Zhao Yunru looked at her and opened her mouth. In the end she could only sigh. Only Zheng Zimo looked up at Li Yi. She had seen everything that he had whispered to Wan Ruoqing. Partridge sky. Just at this time Li Yi spoke lightly. Partridge sky? Some of the candidates' expressions froze. It's a poem, someone immediately said. So the lyricist was that brother. Everyone immediately understood. However, because of this, their confidence in the Yuniying Poetry Society decreased a bit. Even though poetry was often mentioned together, there were great differences in both style and rhythm. To study one of them required a great deal of time and energy, not to mention someone who was a master of both poetry and poetry. Such a talent would have long been famous throughout the world. There was no way they wouldn't recognize him. The standard of drinking alone under the moon was already high enough to make them gasp in surprise. If a poem written on the spot could beat Su Wentian, then Su Wentian wouldn't be the only one who would feel ashamed. Su Wentian's smile remained on his face, his heart full of confidence. Not to mention that the person in front of him was only an unknown scholar. Even if the #1 scholar in Qingyan Prefecture wrote a poem on the spot, he wouldn't be afraid. When the time came, the work would be mediocre again. Let's see how they clean up the mess. When Li Yi's voice came, the women of the Yuniying Poetry Society paused. Then they abruptly raised their heads, hope rising in their eyes. It was the same scene as before. Could this young master once again reverse the situation? Zheng Zimo looked at the scholar's calm expression. For some reason, her heart suddenly calmed down. It was also at this time that Li Yi's voice once again clearly reached everyone's ears. Blowing through the lingering smoke into the night wind, a bright moon hangs above the curtain. When the night wind blew through the thin mist and the bright moon hung outside the curtain uncontrollably appeared in their minds, the expressions on their faces froze. Because the road is far, the person is still far. Even if our hearts sleep together, we are not together. Li Yi's voice continued. It was as if Ruoqing was using graceful and agile hairpin-style small regular script to transcribe the words onto the Xian paper. Deep in love, deep in thought, the blue clouds return without a trace. Only like in a previous life, love separated mandarin ducks in 2 cages. After reading Lu Yong's Remembering Your Charm, Li Yi picked up the tea beside him and took a sip. Only then did he realize that the venue had suddenly quieted down. The little servant girl blinked her large eyes and unconsciously moved closer to Li Yi. The atmosphere was eerily quiet and the young girl was somewhat afraid. A moment later, a sound finally came from the venue. Su Wentian turned his head. The expression on his face was indescribable. He opened his mouth but did not say anything in the end. He pushed through the crowd and walked out without a word. Only when his figure disappeared through the door did an uproar suddenly erupt from the crowd. Using a long and slow poem to describe parting and yearning. Although it is plain and unadorned, it is incisive. It seems plain and straightforward, but it shows even more the sorrow of parting. I did not think that brother would be a master of both poetry and poetry. I am impressed. In an instant, many people with complicated expressions cupped their hands towards Li Yi and said, Su Wentian knows that he is not as good as brother and has already left. Today's competition is won by the Yunning Poetry Club. Although the process was complicated, in the end they still won. All the women of the Yunning Poetry Club had expressions of joy on their faces. Occasionally they would use their beautiful eyes to secretly examine Li Yi. His entire poem was filled with the sorrow of parting. This young master was probably thinking of his lover. They just did not know which woman was so lucky to be able to receive the favor of this young master. At this time, in the hearts of these talented women, this handsome young master who was a master of both poetry and poetry had long surpassed Yang Yanzhou, Shen Zhao and the others. He was almost at the same level as the Li Yi of the Immortal of the Magpie Bridge. Chapter 77. Although this Remembering Your Charm wasn't Lu Yong's best work, but as the saying goes, where there's water one can sing willow poems, Lu Sanbian's talent wasn't just for show. Any random piece he took out wasn't something any random cat or dog could compare to. Su Wentian's literary talent was unknown, but he knew his own limitations. This could be considered an advantage. After Su Wentian left, the people of the Dongli Poetry Club also left dejectedly, including some people who were close to Su Wentian. They did not have the face to stay here anymore. After all, Su Wentian was too cocky just now. Unfortunately, the higher he climbed, the more painful the fall. Not only did it cause the Dongli Poetry Club to lose the right to participate in the Mid-Autumn Festival, Su Wentian himself would not be able to stand among the other scholars in the future. If it wasn't for young master today, it would be us who left just now. The leader of the Yunning Poetry Club, a woman called Zhao Yunru, brought over a tray covered with a red cloth. She bowed slightly and said, These 100 taels of silver are for today's champion. Please accept them and don't refuse. Thank you, Miss Zhao. I won't stand on ceremony then. Li Yi smiled as he took the tray from Zhao Yunru. The smile on his face became even brighter. He really had nothing to decline. This 100 taels of silver was his ultimate goal. If it wasn't for the Yunning Poetry Club, he wouldn't be able to get the silver no matter how good his poems were. Similarly, if it wasn't for him, the Yunning Poetry Club wouldn't be able to have the last laugh and obtain the right to participate in the Mid-Autumn Festival. Everyone took what they needed, no need to stand on ceremony. A poetry competition like this should be held a few more times. Throwing down poems, taking the money and running, wouldn't that be much easier than carrying candied fruits all over the streets? Of course, Li Yi only thought about it in his heart. Such a good thing couldn't be encountered every day. It was more reliable to do business honestly. After all, business could prosper the country. He wrapped the silver in the red cloth, stuffed it into the little servant girl's arms and rubbed her head as he said, Xiao Huan, take the silver. Let's go home. 100 taels of silver was about 7 or 8 caddies. It wasn't heavy for the little servant girl. Xiao Huan had already experienced son-in-law's ability to earn money and was already used to it. She hugged the silver to her bosom, her little face full of smiles. In addition to the silver in her bosom, the servant girl also held tightly onto 2 folded pieces of paper. On the paper were 2 poems written by the young master. Xiao Huan was illiterate and could not remember those 2 poems. Just now when those people were passing them around, the little servant girl secretly kept 2 pieces and planned to bring them home to show Miss in 2nd Mississippi. Just now, the elder sister said that the poem written by the son-in-law was about the sorrow of parting. It was about longing for one's beloved. Could it be that he was talking about Miss? If eldest Miss knew, she would definitely be very happy. That time the son-in-law did not return for the whole night. Everyone thought that the son-in-law had run away. Young Miss did not show any reaction on the surface, but that night she was actually like Xiao Huan, unable to sleep the whole night. The young Miss would also be shocked when she saw the son-in-law's poem. The little maidservant thought to herself, after all, it was not a waste of time. Li Yi's mood was also a little better. Just as he was about to leave with Xiao Huan, he saw Zheng Zimo standing there. His footsteps paused slightly, and after a moment of thought he walked over there. Zheng Zimo saw him walking over, and the expression on her face slightly froze. She subconsciously asked, "What are you going to do?" Li Yi cupped his hands at her and said, "Miss Zimo, I did not mean to offend you that day. I just mistook you for a friend of mine. If I disturbed you, I hope you will not blame me." Because of his mood just now, Li Yi's attitude towards Zheng Zimo was not so friendly, but after all it was his fault. In this era, holding a woman's hand was already a very serious offense. It was understandable for the other party to call him a lecher. Of course, these 2 sentences at this time were not asking for forgiveness, but just expressing his attitude. After all, they had stood on the same front and fought together. A mistake was a mistake. Even if they would not have a chance to meet again in the future, some words were said, and their thoughts would eventually be more clear. Hearing Li Yi's words, Zheng Zimo's expression was slightly startled. He would actually apologize to her. This was something Zheng Zimo had never thought of. After experiencing what had just happened, Zheng Zimo was already very clear in her heart that even though this scholar was unreasonable, his talent was shockingly high. At the very least he was much better than Su Wentian, and perhaps he wasn't inferior to Yang Yanzhou or Shen Zhao. Which one of these geniuses wasn't a proud and arrogant person? In public he would bow his head and apologize to a woman? But she had also seen many scenes. After a moment of surprise, the expression on her pretty face quickly returned to normal. She bowed slightly to Li Yi and said, "Since it was not intentional, there is no need to mention this matter in the future." Li Yi did not know that Zheng Zimo had already thought that what happened that day was only a misunderstanding. What she wanted was exactly Li Yi's attitude. Originally he thought that she would call him a lecher like before. Li Yi had already mentally prepared himself for this. He did not think that she would actually bow and return the greeting. It was clear that she did not intend to pursue the matter. "I wonder if you will participate in tomorrow's Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet?" At this time Zhao Yunru walked over and asked Li Yi with a smile. In Zhao Yunru's view, with the talent he had displayed today, if he could participate in the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet, he would definitely shine. At that time, it would not be impossible for him to surpass Yang Yanzhou and Xin Zhao and obtain the title of the #1 scholar in Qing'an Prefecture. "To be honest, Miss Zhao, I have no interest in the poetry meet." Li Yi smiled and then raised his hands in a salute to the crowd. He said, "It's getting late. If there is nothing else, I will leave first." Hearing the first half of his words, the women of the Yunying Poetry Society were stunned. The poetry meet that they dreamed of participating in the eyes of the other, was not even worth mentioning. At this time in Wan Ruoqing's mind, the image of him casually tossing Su Wentian's poem to the side floated up. Her heart suddenly felt relieved. This young master does things differently from normal scholars. He is most likely a noble person and does not care about empty reputation. Also, with his talent in poetry, he does not need to compete with others. As she thought this, she suddenly seemed to remember something. Her expression changed slightly. When she turned her head, the figure of the scholar and the servant girl had already disappeared through the door. "I was only thinking about the poem just now and forgot to ask for that young master's name," she exclaimed softly and hurriedly chased after them. After a moment, Wan Ruoqing stood on the street and looked at the bustling crowd. She could not see the end of the crowd. She gave a long sigh and turned to walk back. You're tuning in to the Zhou Xian's Legacy YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.